Welcome, dear listener. Tonight, you're invited to take a slow and dreamy journey, one that drifts quietly through time, through superstition and sleep, through memory and moonlight. In the soft hush of the evening, when the world begins to quiet and the sky turns a deep velvet blue, there rises a silver light that has watched over humanity for as long as memory exists. The moon, silent, glowing, timeless, has always been more than just a celestial body. It has been a guide, a symbol, a secret keeper. It has sparked myths, stirred madness, shaped rituals, and cast its gentle glow over some of our most haunting and beautiful beliefs. This is not just a history. It is a soft unraveling of how we once feared the moon might drive us mad. So lay back now, let your breath slow, let the weight of the day melt away. You are safe here, wrapped in calm, drifting gently with the rhythm of the past. There is no need to hurry, no need to think too much. Just let the quiet story unfold like moonlight spilling across the floor. And as the moon rises high in the night sky, let it light the path into dream. You're exactly where you need to be. Welcome. The world was silent in those earliest nights, long before the hum of cities or the ticking of clocks, before stories had names or language had grammar, when all that stirred after dusk were the sighs of wind through tall grasses and the occasional whisper of water against stone. The sky, when night fell, was a black canopy stretching forever, vast and unknowable. And in its center, in those moments when the clouds drifted aside, there rose a pale, glowing orb that hung with silent certainty. The moon, round and full, or curved and thin like a silver smile, appeared as if placed there deliberately, a watching eye, a quiet god, a secret companion to those early wanderers who looked up from the darkened earth and felt something stirred deep inside them. They did not yet know what to call it. This feeling of awe, of smallness, of being seen, but it wrapped around them nonetheless like a cool breeze brushing the back of the neck, unsettling and beautiful in equal measure. Before the first temples, before the first altars, there were fires, and around those fires sat people, barefoot and wide-eyed, telling wordless stories with gestures and glances, huddled in animal skins, watching as the moon traced its path to the heavens night after night. And in these quiet gatherings, the moon became more than a light. It became a presence. Sometimes it seemed kind, pouring its silver over the earth in gentle waves, illuminating sleeping children and the soft curve of riverbanks. But other times, when it rose in its fullest form, glaring and bright, it felt too much like a face. Its stillness felt accusatory. Its light revealed things not meant to be seen. Shadows with edges too sharp, the gleam in a predator's eyes, the strange unease that made people wake from dreams without understanding why their hearts were racing. In these ancient hours, before the first calendar was scratched onto bone, people began to notice something. When the moon grew full, things changed. The animals grew restless. The night birds flew longer. Some people tossed and turned, moaning in their sleep. Others walked out into the night without remembering, their eyes open but unseeing, drawn to the silver glow as if summoned. And sometimes, very rarely but never forgotten, someone would change altogether. A quiet man would suddenly become violent. A calm woman might scream at shadows. A child might weep uncontrollably until the moon began to wane. There were no words for these things, no explanations, only patterns noticed and shared in murmurs. The moon did something to people. It touched something inside them, something buried and delicate, and it didn't always leave that part unchanged. In the hollows of forests and the mouths of caves, in the high places where mountains scratched the sky, primitive etchings of the moon began to appear, circles carved into rock, spirals that seemed to reflect the phases, dots marking cycles. These were not decorations. They were warnings, or prayers, or perhaps both. The people were learning to track it, to anticipate its moods, because they feared what might happen if they didn't. They began to build their lives around its rhythm, when to plant, when to hunt, when to sleep indoors and lock the doors with bone and thorn. The moon became a clock not just of time, but of temperament, and this new awareness that the moon could shape behavior rooted itself so deeply into human imagination that even as civilizations rose and languages formed, that old fear never truly vanished. As the centuries passed and the first cities appeared, as brick replaced mud and firelight was joined by oil lamps and then torches, the moon never lost its place. People looked upward still, night after night, and whisper to one another when it turned full and bright again. Its influence became legend. In hushed tones, they spoke of madness that rose with the moon's light, of feverish dreams and sudden violence, of people who disappeared into the woods never to return. They didn't know about hormones or tides or circadian rhythms, but they felt the pulse of the moon in their blood, in their skin, in their thoughts, and they feared it. There was something about the way it watched, that it never blinked, that it seemed to hover in place even as the stars wheeled around it, that its phases marked more than time. They marked moods. It could vanish entirely for nights at a time, and then return, stronger, bolder, like a thought that had been pushed away but refused to stay gone. For the earliest humans, the moon was not just a light. It was a force, a quiet manipulator, a god who never spoke, but whose silence pressed down upon the chest like a weight. They built myths around it, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. The moon demanded explanation. And so they gave it names Selene Nana, Nine Chel, depending on the land and the tongue, but always treated with reverence and caution. It was not a comforting god. It was a mirror of what they didn't understand within themselves. The part that could shift without warning, that could feel joy one day and sorrow the next, that could be stirred by nothing at all but the turning of the sky. And so, beneath the moon's first pale light, humanity began to suspect that madness did not always come from within, that perhaps it could ascend from above, quiet and soft, carried on beams of cold silver, slipping into the mind like fog over a field. And once that suspicion took root, it would never quite let go. Generation after generation would continue to watch the moon, not just in awe, but with unease. For they had seen too many eyes turn glassy beneath its glow. They had heard too many strange cries in the full moon dark. They had learned that when the moon was fullest, the soul felt most unguarded. And though they had no science, no diagnoses, no laboratories to measure or explain, they had one great and ancient tool, memory. And memory does not lie the way data can. It remembers fear. It remembers silence. It remembers the way a quiet night can feel too loud under the gaze of a celestial eye. And so, as the moon rose and the wind stirred the leaves once more, people wrapped their arms around their knees, pulled their cloaks tighter, and whispered stories they were never sure were real, only that they were remembered. And as the moon began its climb to its highest point, as the world lay half in shadow and half in cold silver glow, a new generation of thinkers began to put words to what had always been felt. That perhaps madness and moonlight were not separate after all. That what rose in the sky might also rise in the mind. It was in the early cradle of civilization, in those fertile valleys where rivers carved life into dust and empires rose in the soft silt of irrigation, that the moon gained not only myth but measurement. The Sumerians, whose cuneiform tablets recorded the very first attempts to organize time and thought, turned their eyes toward the heavens not just with wonder, but with purpose. They saw the moon's regularity, its loyal return night after night, and began to record its rhythms on clay. They charted its phases, learned its cycle, and called upon its presence as a divine regulator of months, tides, crops, and moods. In their temples of baked brick, they whispered the name of Nana, the moon god, guardian of wisdom and vision. His crescent crown hovered above his forehead, and yet behind his serene expression was a truth they had long suspected. The moon did not merely guide, it governed. The priests of Uar and Eridu believed that celestial bodies were more than lights. They were living forces. The sun burned with justice. The stars whispered fate, and the moon observed. It saw into the secret heart. They knew that when Nana waxed full and hung large over the desert, strange things stirred in the hearts of men. A scribe might tremble with fever. A hunter might return to his family with eyes that no longer blinked. A mother might cry at night for reasons she could not explain. And because these things coincided so often with the fattening of the moon, the people began to tie the two together. The light was beautiful, yes, but it was also potent, dangerous. Watching, the Babylonians, who inherited much from the Sumerians, took these beliefs and wrapped them in layers of astrology. They saw the moon as a marker of prophecy. When it passed through certain constellations, they believed it stirred fates long written in the sky. And while their calendars grew more precise, their understanding of the mind remained tethered to the stars. Madness, to them, was not a disorder, it was a possession, not by demons always, but sometimes by divine forces, by spirits of sky and night that slipped into men during vulnerable hours. The moonlight, cool and pale, was a door through which these spirits passed. On nights of fullness, temples would ring with chants and offerings, not only for prosperity, but to ward off imbalance, because it was well known among the temple scribes and court physicians that certain men, particularly those with fragile constitutions, should not be left alone under the gaze of the moon. Farther west, in Egypt, where the Nile mirrored the heavens and pyramids pointed like stone fingers into the sky, the moon held a quieter, more measured place in the divine hierarchy. Yet even there, among the precision of the scribes and the rituals of the priests, the moon had its shadows. Thoth, the god of wisdom and measurement, was closely tied to the moon. He kept order, maintained balance, recorded the fates of men with his ibis beak and scroll. But balance, the Egyptians knew, was delicate. Too much of one force, even something as calming as moonlight, could tip the scales. The priest astrologers observed that during certain lunar alignments, the sick grew worse, the dreams of the pharaoh more disturbed, the Nile's waters more turbulent. They didn't blame the moon directly. That would be irreverent. But they watched it. They respected its quiet power. They knew that anything that moved the tides of the great river could just as easily stir the waters of the mind. And so, across these earliest civilizations, from the ziggurats of Mesopotamia to the sun-bathed temples of Thebes, the moon was cataloged, feared, and honored not only as a timekeeper, but as a quiet architect of emotion. They did not speak of mental illness as modernity would later define it, but they knew restlessness. They knew dread. They knew what it looked like when a man could no longer sleep, or when a child screamed in the night with no wound to explain it. And time and again, they recorded that these episodes rose with the moon. The ancient texts do not describe syndromes or symptoms. They tell of darkness in the head, of the river turning backward within, of the eye that forgets what it sees. These were their ways of describing what could not be explained. And when these expressions appeared in tablets or temple walls alongside symbols of the full moon, a pattern became unmistakable. The moon did something. The scribes may not have known how, but they had seen enough to be sure. The correlation was not one of mere superstition. It was born of observation, careful and consistent, passed down in ink and stone. In rituals, then, the moon took center stage. Priests donned white robes under full moons and spoke invocations to cleanse the mind. Women who feared for their sanity were brought into sacred courtyards and bathed in water mixed with moonlit herbs. Children who saw things that were not, they were taken to high places where moonlight fell uninterrupted, in hopes that the madness might be drawn out by the moon itself, like poison from a wound. Madness, they believed, came and went in cycles, and the moon's cycle was its clock. These beliefs didn't exist in isolation. They were built upon generation after generation of watching, fearing, remembering. One scribe would notice a brother pacing more under the full moon. A healer would mark that fevers ran higher during lunar brightness. A priest would record that his visions grew stronger when the night was most silver. And all these small, quiet observations wove themselves into a great cultural memory, a belief not imposed from dogma, but grown from lived experience. The moon did not strike like a hammer. It seeped in like mist. And so it was that the earliest civilizations, for all their stone and astronomy, still trembled when the moon grew large. They lit fires not just for warmth, but to ward off whatever unseen thing the moon might bring. They sang chants to keep the mind steady. They wrote prayers to keep their dreams from splintering. They walked slowly under the sky, never looking up for too long, as though afraid that I in the heavens might look back too deeply and see the cracks already forming. As these empires aged and as their knowledge deepened, the belief in lunar madness did not vanish. It took root even more firmly. For if the greatest minds of their age could not explain why the soul stirred uneasily under moonlight, then surely it must be the moon's doing. And as the moon rose once more over the Tigris, over the Nile, over the temples and tombs and palaces of old, people lay in their beds, their faces turned to the wall, their minds whispering fears they dared not say aloud. And it was in this ancient hush, this shared unease beneath the moon's silver eye, that a new civilization, across the sea, began to take shape, one that would get named the madness they had all known, and begin to build stories around it so vividly that they would echo across centuries, across the shimmering blue waters of the eastern Mediterranean, where olive trees clung to dry hillsides and temple columns rose like ribs in the earth. A new people emerged who would not only fear the moon, but give language to that fear, shaping it into a word so enduring it would echo through time. The ancient Greeks, ever observant, ever poetic, watched the moon just as those before them had, but they did so with a blend of myth and logic, reverence and inquiry. They did not merely bow before its silver glow. They gave a family, a story, a place in the great architecture of heaven. They called her Selene, the goddess who drove her chariot of pale horses across the night sky, her luminous face ever watching, ever silent, ever present. And while she was beautiful, soothing, even, there was something about her constant return that unnerved the thoughtful minds of Greece. Because beauty, when it repeats itself with unerring precision, becomes something else. It becomes a pattern. And patterns are watched most closely when they are tied to fear. The Greeks were the first to speak of the mind as something both divine and vulnerable. They believed it could be touched, stirred, even undone by forces beyond human reach. They debated the soul, the passions, the humors, the mysterious vapors that rose from the belly and fogged reason. And in this deeply philosophical culture, where poets sang of gods and physicians studied illness with keen eyes, the moon came to be seen as both muse and menace. For when the full moon rose high over the Aegean and the night turned silver and strange, something shifted, not just in the world, but in people. Fishermen refused to sail. Dogs howled longer. Children cried in their sleep. And some, once gentle and serene, fell into wild fits of weeping or laughter or rage without cause. There was no wound to point to, no injury to explain it. Only the moon. It was from the sense of unease, so familiar and so feared, that the Greeks gave birth to a word, lunaticos, from luna, the moon. It described not merely madness, but madness that came and went like tides, that arrived uninvited and stayed just long enough to leave ruin in its wake. This word, heavy with suspicion and sorrow, did not blame the sufferer. Instead, it acknowledged something ancient and helpless, that the moon could reach inside a man and loosen something vital. It could unstring the harp of the mind, if only for a night. Greek physicians, following the teachings of Hippocrates, began to note how certain illnesses seemed to follow lunar patterns. Epilepsy, in particular, known then as a sacred disease, was thought to be linked to the heavens. The Greeks were among the first to describe it in medical terms, attempting to understand it as a disorder rather than a curse, but still they could not quite separate it from the moon. When a seizure occurred under the full glow of Selene, it felt less like coincidence and more like confirmation. The patient was touched not only by some internal imbalance, but by something cold and celestial. In Athens, where logic and rhetoric flourished, philosophers debated the soul's fragility. Plato mused on the madness that led to poetic inspiration, while Aristotle considered how celestial bodies influenced earthly matter. And yet, even in their reason, there lingered a quiet concession, that perhaps not everything in the mind could be explained by balance alone. Perhaps there were forces beyond the physical that stirred the waters of thought. The moon, with its unblinking eye, remained a prime suspect. The playwrights of the time, those weavers of tragedy and mirth, knew well how to use the moon as a mirror of inner turmoil. In the soft glow of torchlit theaters under open skies, audiences watched characters unravel under the moonlight's influence. Madness was not hidden. It was performed, explored, lamented, and often, in those most unguarded moments, when a character wept alone or confessed terrible visions, it was the moon that had driven them to it. In these stories, the moon was not just a backdrop. It was a character, a silent participant in the drama of the human mind. And outside the city walls, among shepherds and farmers, the old beliefs remained. Though temples praised Athena and Apollo, the common folk still feared Selene. Her phases were tracked not with philosophy but with feeling. They knew when to stay indoors, when to burn herbs at the doorway, when to tie knots of garlic and wool above the beds of children. If a neighbor began muttering at shadows, they didn't speak of humors or imbalances. They pointed to the sky and said simply, "It is the moon." There were stories, too, quiet tales told by old women in doorways, at the edge of fires, of men who wandered into the hills on full moon nights and returned changed, silent and pale, with eyes that blinked too slowly, of women who woke with bruises and no memory of how they had come to lie in fields, of whispers that the moon could steal pieces of the soul little by little with each of its cycles. No temple sanctioned these tales, but they endured, passed from mouth to mouth like warnings wrapped in poetry. In the darker corners of Greek medicine, less formal than the schools of Kos and Nidus, there were healers who mixed lunar remedies, silver powders, herbs harvested by moonlight, stones said to calm the mind when placed on the forehead during sleep. They did not always work, but people believed in them, and sometimes belief is a kind of balm all its own. The sick and the sorrowful clutched these tokens and whispered prayers to Selene, not asking for miracles, only for peace, for quiet, for rest. And so the word lunatic grew not from cruelty, but from centuries of observation and helplessness. It was a label born of awe, a recognition that something beautiful could also be dangerous. That light could be too bright, that silence could be too loud. And once this word was spoken, it found a home in every language that followed, nestled into the corners of medicine, myth, and law. As the moon continued its endless dance to the heavens, unbothered and unchanged, the people beneath it continued to watch with cautious eyes. In the courtyards of Corinth, in the olive groves of Delphi, in the libraries of Alexandria, the stories continued. The physicians kept their notes. The poets penned their laments. And the moon, ever watchful, ever patient, listened without reply. And in the twilight of the civilization, as marble began to crack and voices turned toward Rome, the belief in lunar madness did not vanish. It shifted. It found new names, new gods, new explanations. But always the fear remained. For no empire, however enlightened, can look long at the full moon without feeling that old, familiar chill. And so, as Greek thought gave way to Roman order and the language of lunacy passed into Latin tongues, a new empire rose, one that would inherit the word, the fear, and the strange, sleepless gaze of the moon. When the Greeks spoke of lunacy with poetry and philosophical uncertainty, the Romans, in their ever-practical way, took the same whispered fears and tried to hold in their hands like a law, to define them, to shape them into rules that could be followed, broken, and enforced. They inherited not only the language of lunacy, but the deep cultural suspicion that had grown with each cycle of the moon. And so, as the Roman Republic rose and then gave way to empire, with its wide stone roads and endless bureaucracies, the belief that the moon could meddle with the mind traveled with the legions and merchants and magistrates, reaching every outpost and province under Roman rule. From Britannia's misty fields to the scorched sands of Egypt, the moon was known and feared as more than a celestial body. It was a force that slipped through barred windows and heavy doors, reaching silently into the minds of both slave and senator alike. The Roman worldview was one of order, of balance, justice, and hierarchy. The gods had their realms. The people had their duties. The body had its humors, and the mind its rightful place beneath the will. But the moon, with its cycles of waxing and waning, its refusal to remain constant, stood in opposition to that Roman ideal. And because the Romans feared disorder, feared unpredictability more than almost anything else, they kept a wary eye on the sky, marking the phases not only for planting and harvest, but for signs of instability, of imbalance, of approaching madness. It was the Roman physicians, steeped in Greek teachings and surrounded by their own observations, who wrote more formally of the moon's effect on the mind. They believed, with the confidence of men who wore robes and carried scrolls, that the moon's glow had the power to stir the four humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, that ruled all behavior and health. The full moon, they said, heated the blood and made it rise, agitating the heart, quickening the pulse, and awakening thoughts that would otherwise remain dormant. These were not the wild conjectures of mystics, but the learned assertions of medical thinkers like Galen, whose writings would shape European medicine for centuries. And in these writings, the moon was not simply a background presence. It was a cause, a catalyst, an agent of change within the delicate architecture of the mind. Roman asylums, though far removed from the structured institutions of later centuries, were places where those deemed unstable were kept under supervision, often in temples, often in silence. And among the records kept by priests and healers, there were notes of lunar phases, patients who screamed only during the full moon, patients who became serene as the moon waned, patients who could not sleep unless the moon was hidden behind clouds. These patterns were not ignored. They were studied, even if the conclusions drawn were steeped in fear rather than understanding. In the streets of Rome itself, in the bustling marketplaces and shaded atriums, stories of moon-born madness flourished. It was said that a man named Lucius, once a respected merchant, stood one night in the Forum under the full moon and tore off his garments, laughing at gods only he could see. He was found at dawn, weeping in the Tiber, unaware of who he was. His name passed into rumor. Mothers warned their children not to wander on nights when the moon was high. Soldiers refused to patrol alone under its light. Priests carried charms sewn into the hems of their robes. And always, behind the measured voice of the empire, there was that quiet acknowledgement that the moon could undo what law and reason try to hold together. Even among the elite, who read philosophy and dined beneath frescoed ceilings, the moon was spoken of with careful language. They did not deny its beauty. No. They wrote poems in its honor, praised Diana, goddess of the hunt and the moon, whose silver bow hung in the sky. But beneath their verses lay a quiet dread. Diana, after all, was also goddess of the wild places, of sudden violence, of instinct untamed. She walked alone, untouched, unknowable, and her light was not warm like the sun. It was cold, impartial, and sharp-edged, like a blade drawn in the dark. The lunar calendar, which guided the Roman months, ensured that every full moon was not only visible but officially marked. There were nights of sacrifice, nights of ritual, and nights when omens were read in the moon's face. Seers and augurs cast their predictions based not only on the flights of birds or the entrails of beasts, but on the clarity and brightness of the moon. A halo around it was seen as a warning. A reddish hue foretold unrest. And when the moon was unusually large and luminous, what we might now call supermoon, people whispered that its power was strongest, its reach deeper, its ability to touch the soul most dangerous. This belief in lunar influence extended even into the courtrooms of Rome. Though law was the empire's pride and logic its shield, there were cases where madness was claimed and the full moon sighted. Not formally, perhaps, but through testimony, through subtle implications that a crime committed under the full moon might be the result not of intent, but of a momentary possession. The word lunaticus appeared in legal and medical texts alike, not as metaphor, but as a genuine condition, one that came and went with the moon's phases. It was not yet treated with compassion, but it was recognized, and that recognition alone gave it power. As Rome expanded, absorbing the lands and legends of dozens of cultures, it gathered stories of the moon like coins from conquered cities. The Gauls believed the moon could steal breath. The Egyptians whispered that it drew out the soul in sleep. In Judea, the afflicted were brought to hillsides during full moons for exorcism. And in each of these places, the Roman lens refocused the tale, adding structure, law, and vocabulary to what had long been experience and myth. But for all their roads, their aqueducts, their armies and codes, the Romans could not build a wall against the moon. It watched their triumphs and their ruins. It gleamed on polished armor and wet cobblestones. It lit the palaces of emperors and the cells of the condemned. And as the empire aged, as its edges frayed and its heart grew decadent, the belief in lunar madness remained, one of the few fears shared equally by senator and servant. So when the moon rose high over crumbling colosseums and the darkening villas, it brought with it not just light, but memory, the memory of madness, the memory of all that Roman law could not command. And as Rome gave way to shadow, and the centuries crept forward into the dark forests and foggy monasteries of medieval Europe, the moon would carry with it this ancient fear, tucked into the folds of robes, etched into manuscripts, sewn into prayers whispered by candlelight. And in those centuries to come, centuries of plague and prophecy, of saints and superstition, the moon would not be seen as a goddess or a calendar, but as a menace, a source of sickness, a ghost in the sky. And once again, it would be mothers and midwives, monks and madmen who kept the stories alive. And so, as the Roman Empire slowly crumbled into dust and legend, its aqueducts running dry and its roads swallowed by ivy and war, the moon remained, unchanged, unmoved, untouchable. It drifted silently above the ruins of amphitheaters and temples, casting its cool, impartial gaze upon the shifting world below. The great philosophies of Greece and the crisp rationality of Rome gave way to something older, something darker, something wrapped in incense and prayer and the ever-present fear of unseen forces. It was now the time of monasteries and manuscripts, of whispered blessings and holy relics, of bells that rang not just for mass, but for warding off the devil. And in this new medieval world, mud-caked, plague-haunted, and soul-obsessed, the moon was no longer a goddess or a healer. It became once more a danger. Medicine in the Middle Ages was not what it had been. The formal writings of Hippocrates and Galen were still copied and revered, but their understanding was now filtered through the lens of Christian doctrine and folk belief. The mind was no longer simply an organ that could be stirred by the humors. It was a battleground for the eternal war between good and evil, God and the devil, salvation and damnation. Madness, then, was not just an illness. It was a spiritual event, a rupture, a visible sign of an invisible war. And when such episodes coincided with the full moon, as they so often seem to do, it was taken not as coincidence but as a sign, a warning from above. In the halls of stone monasteries, where learned monks pored over crumbling texts by candlelight, there were careful notations, scraps of Latin scrawled into the margins beside lists of symptoms and treatments. Patient grew restless under luna plena, one might read. Another might simply say, fever of the mind coincided with heavenly fullness. These were not diagnoses. They were observations, fearful, repeated, undeniable. The moon, they wrote, did something, and because they could not explain it, they folded the mystery into faith. God allowed signs, after all. The moon could be a sign of divine displeasure, or worse, a vessel for Satan's whisperings. What else could explain the sudden howling? The scratching of the walls? The eyes that saw flames where there were none? And in the villages and hamlets beyond the monastery walls, where the air was thick with smoke and superstition, the moon was feared more openly. Here, stories flowed freely. Stories of madness, yes, but also of transformation, of women who walked out under the full moon and returned unable to speak, of men who wandered into the forest and came back with dirt under their fingernails and blood on their clothes, not knowing how or why. The moon, the people said, made the soul restless. It called things forth, things best left sleeping. Midwives, often the only source of medical knowledge in a town, kept calendars carved into wood or etched into wax tablets. They did not only mark the time for childbirths and herbs. They marked the moons. Full moons were feared not only for difficult births or bleeding, but for what came afterward. It was said that a child born beneath a full moon might carry its mark forever, fated to madness or visions or worse. Such children were watched closely. If they cried too much or smiled at nothing or stared too long at the sky, whispers would begin. Moon touch, the villagers would say, and once spoken, that label rarely faded. The medical theories of the time still spoke of humors, and it was commonly believed that the moon influenced the body through its control of moisture. After all, the moon moved the tides, and was it not true that the human body was mostly water? Physicians argued that the full moon caused the fluids of the brain, what they called the moist humors, to swell and shift. And when those fluids moved, the balance of reason was lost. Madness, in this view, was not only spiritual, it was physical, a result of tides within the skull. To guard against such imbalance, patients were sometimes bled during the full moon. Leeches were applied, wrists were opened, bowls of dark blood collected in hopes that the unrest would drain out with it. Others were given bitter draughts. Sedatives made from poppy or belladonna, meant to dull the senses until moon passed. But not all treatments were so clinical. In many regions, healing rituals combined scripture with superstition. Holy water was sprinkled in circles. Psalms were chanted while walking counterclockwise under the moonlight. Herbs were gathered only at dawn, before the moon could see them, and buried beside the threshold of the afflicted's home. And in some places, mirrors were covered during full moons, not to ward off spirits, but to prevent the sufferer from seeing their own reflection and slipping further into lunacy. The belief was simple. Under the full moon, the self could become unmoored, lost, fragmented. These fears were not confined to the sick. Entire communities prepared for the full moon as if for a coming storm. Church bells were rung at dusk. Candles were lit in windows. Doors were barred with more care. Children were told to stay inside. Livestock were locked away, as it was believed that even animals were not immune. And should a scream echo through the village after dark, no one went to investigate until the first light of dawn. The moon was not to be challenged. It was to be endured. And yet, in spite of all this, or perhaps because of it, the moon still held a strange, terrible beauty. It shone upon the stained glass windows of chapels and the thatched roofs of peasants' huts alike. It lit the fields where serfs toiled and the cloisters where monks prayed. Its light was the same for all, cold, impartial, ancient. And in that shared light, a shared fear grew, a fear passed down not through books alone, but through lullabies, laments, and warnings. The moon, they said, could see your sins. The moon could find what was broken in you. The moon could wake things that were meant to sleep. And so, the medieval mind carried this burden through generations, a mix of science and superstition, theology and terror. The moon was not merely a phase in the sky. It was a phase in the soul, recurring, relentless, always threatening to return. And just as it reached its fullest and brightest and most unnerving form, people whispered prayers and watched their loved ones a little closer, wondering if this would be the night when the change came. And from these centuries of night-bound fear, the stories multiplied. Fears turned to folklore, names turned to curses, and strange transformations began to haunt not only the living but the literature, too. For what began as quiet dread in the sick room and whispered observation in the chapel would soon grow claws and teeth in the darkened forest of the mind, as a new kind of moon madness took hold. One that walked on two legs, but howled like a beast. Out beyond the church walls, past the reach of the monk's torch and the doctor's tincture, in the thatched villages tucked between woods and hills and bogs, the moon did not merely influence the mind, it shaped the stories themselves. In these quiet places, where life was ruled more by the rhythm of animals than by scripture or scroll, the moon was not an object of study, nor even a heavenly sign. It was a creature of its own, alive in its way, and feared like a beast that padded softly across the rooftops while the rest of the world slept. Here, the people had no need for humors or heavenly charts to tell them what they already felt in their bones. That's something the full moon reached into the soul, stirring old instincts, waking dark dreams, and dragging the mind, however gently, toward the edge of reason. The stories they told each other around her fires were not medical, nor were they philosophical. They were raw, murmured tales handed from one mouth to another like offerings, never written, always known. Some were warnings. Others were explanations for things that could not be explained any other way. A man who screamed in his sleep each full moon was not merely sick. He had been cursed under a silver sky. A woman who walked the lanes barefoot at night and spoke in tongues was not mad. She had once looked the moon straight in the eye, and it had not blinked. The children who were born on the night of the hunter's moon, with wide, unblinking eyes, would one day vanish into the woods. These were not legends so much as memories shared between generations, warnings disguised as folklore, designed not to entertain, but to endure. The most persistent of these tales was one told across dozens of cultures in different voices and shapes, yet always the same at heart, that under the full moon, man could become beast. This belief, the transformation of flesh into fur, reason into instinct, hands into claws, found root not in the cities, but in the villages, where people lived close to the land and feared it as much as they relied on it. They called them by many names: werewolves, loup-garou, skinwalkers, shapeshifters. But the rhythm of the story was constant. A man cursed or bitten or born under the wrong moon would lose himself on certain nights, the light of the full moon flooding his veins like fire, burning away memory, mercy, and thought. And as the moon rose over quiet, thatched roofs, mothers drew their children in closer, whispering old rhymes into young ears to keep them still. When the moon is round and high, don't go out, don't ask why. Such sayings were like prayers, passed down not to explain, but to protect. They were threads in the fabric of rural life, binding together fear and familiarity. For to these villagers, the moon was not distant or poetic. It was personal. It looked in their windows. It changed the people they knew. There were always stories, recent ones, never far off. A quiet miller who vanished during the full moon and was found days later beside the stream, eyes glassy, hands stained. A farmer's daughter who sat beside the fire all night, silent and still, and could not speak until the moon had waned. A dog that howled and would not stop until the moon dipped below the tree line. No one claimed to know why. No one needed to. The moon was blamed because the moon was always there. Its glow was a witness. It cycled the drumbeat behind the village's strangest hours. In some places, protective rituals grew around these beliefs. Wards were carved into wood and stone, small crescent marks etched into doors and fences. Herbs like mugwort and vervain were hung from rafters. Some villagers kept iron near their beds, believing that the cold strength of metal could keep the madness at bay. Others covered mirrors, turned all shoes upside down, or left bowls of salt at thresholds, acts that might seem meaningless to outsiders, but which carried generations of superstition in their quiet performance. These were not merely traditions. They were lifelines. And though priests might have condemned such acts as pagan folly, and physicians might have dismissed them as the fears of the uneducated, the people held on to them with stubborn devotion. Because when a neighbor woke screaming with no memory, or a child was found wandering, barefoot and weeping, on the morning after bright moon, it wasn't scripture or scholarship they turned to. It was the old tales, the ones that explained madness not with humors or sin, but with light, cold, silvery light that touched the skin and sank beneath it. Even the animals, they said, could feel it. Horses that refused to be saddled, cows that produced sour milk, chickens that laid no eggs, dogs that barked all night without pause. The moon's reach, it was believed, did not end at the mind of man. It stretched into the breath of every living thing. And so, livestock was brought indoors, candles were kept burning, and old songs were hummed beneath blankets to drown out the pull of the moon. There are darker stories, too, ones not told to children, of madness that did not fade with dawn, of people who changed and never changed back, of entire families cursed by moonlight, their blood marked by some forgotten sin. These tales were told only in winter, when the nights were longest and the hearth the only light. They were told softly, as if speaking too loudly might call the moon to the door. These were not myths to be enjoyed. They were warnings wrapped in narrative, heavy with fear. In time, some of these stories would be written down, collected by scholars, twisted by poets, adapted by playwrights. But their origins were never in ink. They were born in silence, in the creak of floorboards beneath a full moon, in the strange laughter heard just past the tree line, in the face of a loved one who, for a single night, did not look entirely familiar. And always behind the tale, there hovered that same old dread, that the moon did not simply shine. It changed. And so, across forests and meadows, from cottage to cottage, the moon continued its slow, indifferent orbit, casting light where none was asked for, shining into places meant to remain dark. And with each cycle, more stories were born, more whispers added to the great, unending tapestry of lunar lore. Because the villagers knew what the scholars sometimes forgot, that fear, when shared long enough, becomes truth, that what is repeated becomes real, that the moon, no matter how often it rose, never rose without consequence. And as those stories deepened, passed from one sleepless night to another, the world began to shift once again. The superstitions of villages gave way to cities of industry, and the age of folklore slowly yielded to the age of reason. But the moon remained, watching, waiting, stirring something old in minds newly obsessed with proof. For even in the age of science, people would find they still could not sleep when the moon was full. And so the old world dimmed, its candlelit superstitions gently flickering beneath the rising glow of something new. Reason, observation, inquiry, a dawning of minds now called enlightenment. In crowded lecture halls, where chalk dust danced like motes in sunlight, and in libraries where books multiplied like vines, the thinkers of this age leaned forward into the world with furrowed brows and sharpened pens, eager to unravel mysteries long feared and long misunderstood. The moon, once the subject of prayer and poetry, now stood beneath the cold lens of science. No longer a goddess or a beast, it became an object, a satellite, a measurable sphere governed by motion and mass. But even as this new clarity sharpened the edges of understanding, even as telescopes peered deeper into craters and curves, the age-old fear did not vanish. It merely changed form. Because while scientists measured tides and mapped orbits, while Newton spoke of gravity and Descartes mind and matter, the people, those who lived not in salons but in narrow streets and fire-warmed homes, continued to feel the same pull they always had. The moon still woke them, still watched them, still cast its light through windows and across thresholds, stirring thoughts that had no place in equations. And even some among the learned, though trained in logic and trained to scoff at ghosts, began to suspect that perhaps the light of full moon, though fully explained, remained a problem unsolved. Doctors of this era, emboldened by anatomy and chemical experimentation, began to catalog human behavior with new vocabulary. They no longer spoke of humors or celestial imbalance. Instead, they sought causes in nerves, in the architecture of the brain, in the electrical language of thought and sensation. But despite their new tools and newer theories, they could not help but notice an old pattern resurfacing. In asylums that were beginning to resemble institutions more than prisons, wardens and physicians alike kept strange calendars, quietly noting when an episode worsened, when the sleeplessness returned, when the shouting and pacing and weeping grew loudest. And more often than not, the mark on the calendar aligned with the full moon. They could not easily admit it, for to do so would seem to step backward, to return to the world of peasant fears and priestly omens. But observations do not care about reputation, and the more they watched, the more they saw. Patients who were calm for weeks would fall into frenzy during the full moon. Others who never spoke would mutter ceaselessly under its glow. Those who feared nothing would cower in corners, and those who feared everything would stand unblinking before barred windows, whispering to sky as though it might answer. In London, in Paris, in Vienna, letters passed between physicians, account of lunar agitation, of heightened nervous activity, of disruptions to mental clarity. Some dismissed these letters outright, calling them the wishful echoes of old myths. Others read them with frowns, uncertain whether to file them away or investigate. But the letters kept coming. From city to city, across countries and languages, the same experiences repeated. And with each passing full moon, another report would arrive, another anecdote would be added to the growing stack of uneasy evidence. Astronomers, too, though tasked with the moon's physical nature, sometimes recorded strange phenomena, not of the moon itself, but of those who gathered to watch it. There were reports of large crowds forming during full moons, more than usual. More accidents, more confrontations, more noise. It was as if the moon, even when demystified, still knew how to stir the world into a slow and silent restlessness. And no matter how clearly its trajectory could be plotted, no matter how precise the shadows it cast through the eyepiece, something about its fullness remained troubling. Philosophers of the Enlightenment, meanwhile, wrestled with the place of the irrational in an increasingly rational world. They argued over the source of madness. Was it a failure of reason or a distortion perception? And could external forces, such as light or motion, truly shape the internal world of thought? These were not easy questions. And though many dismissed the old lunar tales as folklore, a few held to the idea that the mind, still so poorly understood, might yet be susceptible to forces they could not fully map. Voltaire, in his sharp and ironic way, once mocked the idea that the moon could influence madness, calling it a relic of barbarism. But even as he joked, stories continued to pass from city to city, tales not just of the mentally unwell, but the ordinary, the respectable, the scholars and students and clerks who, under the full moon, seemed to waver ever so slightly. Perhaps they argued more sharply. Perhaps they could not sleep. Perhaps their dreams were stranger. Small things, easily dismissed, but still they lingered. And so the Enlightenment, for all its brilliance and progress, carried with it a curious contradiction. The moon had been measured, yes, its shape and motion understood. Its path through the sky could now be calculated with exquisite precision. But its effect on the soul, on sleep, on sadness, on madness, remained a question not easily dismissed. The science explained the shell, the orbit, the reflection of the sun. But it did not explain why people still locked their windows at night, why some doctors still spoke softly of lunacy, as if it were a tide, why police in some cities reported more disturbances during the full moon, more cries in the alley, more sleepless wanderers pacing the night streets. It was in this dissonance, between knowing and feeling, between science and instinct that the moon's old power survived. It no longer needed myths to carry its fear. The fear now wore a new mask, one made of syllables and charts. But beneath it, the face was the same. The moon still changed people. And whether one believed it was gravity or light or ancient rhythm, the result remained. When the moon was full, something stirred. And so, as the age of enlightenment gave way to revolutions and modernity, as new cities bloomed and old fears were buried under layers of culture and law, the moon remained unchanged, its light falling on factories now instead of fields, on gas lamps instead of hearths, on hospitals instead of huts. But its glow still found the eyes of those who could not sleep, still brushed the brows of those who muttered in their beds, still soaked the dreams of those who feared what they might become. And though the thinkers of the Enlightenment had drawn a new map of the heavens, they had not quite erased the oldest road, the one that led from moonlight to madness. That road still wound through the mind, quietly, like a path no longer walked but never forgotten. And as the industrial world began to rise with smoke and steam, that quiet road would find new travelers, new stories, new fears. For in the noise and haste of the new age, people would learn that the moon, though silent, could still whisper, and its voice, older than any machine, would continue to echo in asylums, in dreams, and in minds undone not by myth, but by the enduring mystery of light. As the 19th century unfolded like a great iron gate creaking open, the world transformed itself with engines and coal and steam, the air thickening with the sound of progress and soot, while cities expanded like lungs gasping for breath, their streets teeming with restless bodies and ceaseless motion. And in the shadow of this relentless industrial rise, there emerged buildings not made for factories or finery, but for those whom the world no longer understood, those who had been touched, troubled, or broken by something within or without, those who wandered too far from reason and could not find their way back. These were the asylums, massive institutions with high walls and narrow beds, where madness was no longer feared in the fields or whispered in the village, but confined and catalogued, placed behind locked doors and labeled in heavy ledgers. And in these long corridors where voices echoed against stone and silence, the moon still found a way in. The age of asylums was an age of contradictions. On one hand, it was filled with newfound purpose, a desire to care for mentally ill, to study and soothe, to separate them from a world they could not navigate safely. On the other, it was an age of terrible misunderstanding. Treatments were crude. Theories were often cruel. People were placed in these institutions for reasons that today would seem fragile. Melancholy, hysteria, grief that would not pass, visions too vivid, behaviors too strange. And yet, behind these bars and bolts, the old beliefs remained, reshaped in modern clothing. The moon, though stripped of its divine titles and mythic power, continued to haunt these halls. Orderlies and nurses, often drawn from the same backgrounds as the patients themselves, kept close watch on the lunar calendar. It was not written into medical charts or official records, not formally discussed during clinical meetings, but it was known. In the long nights of these institutions, when the world outside had gone quiet and the lamps flickered low, the approach of a full moon was marked with unease. There would be pacing. There would be howling. Some patients would grow still and stare at the window with wide, shining eyes, lips parted as if they could hear a voice that no one else could. Others would become frantic, their thoughts spinning too fast for speech, their hands trembling with a fear they could not name. Doctors, even those trained in the latest theories of the mind, could not ignore the patterns. Many denied it openly, unwilling to lend credence to anything so old and unprovable. But still, when the moon was full, more staff were scheduled. More sedatives were administered. Restraints, though frowned upon in principle, were prepared just in case. And some physicians began to chart these episodes in private, noting not just the dates of outbursts, but the phase of the moon that accompanied them. They did not publish these findings. The scientific community, ever eager to distance itself from superstition, would not welcome such observations. But within the confines of those echoing buildings, the moon remained an unspoken force. In some asylums, old rituals continued to surface, disguised as routine. Certain wards were darkened during the full moon. Windows were covered with cloth. Beds were shifted away from the light. Some staff members carried amulets. Tokens passed down from grandmothers who still remembered the stories. One nurse in Yorkshire was known to recite a rhyme under her breath whenever the full moon rose. She said it helped her remember who she was and what was real. No one questioned her. In that place, in those hours, any comfort was a kindness. And beyond the staff and the physicians were the patients themselves, whose experiences often defied explanation. Some spoke of visions, of faces in the moonlight, of hands reaching through the glass. Others described a buzzing in their ears, a pressure in their skulls that grew heavier with the rising moon. There were those who felt as if time folded during those nights, as though they had lived through a week in a single hour. One man claimed that the moon whispered his name each time it was full, drawing him upward, pulling at his bones. Another wept quietly in the dark, insisting that the moon could see his sins more clearly than any priest. Even those with no prior history of lunacy, those placed in asylums for grief or trauma or mere poverty, often reported sleeplessness during the full moon. They would lie awake, hearts thudding, eyes darting across the ceiling, unable to rest no matter how tired they were. It was not fear exactly, more like restlessness, like the turning of a key somewhere deep inside them. Some wrote poems about it. Others simply endured, counting the minutes until dawn. Outside the asylums, in the broader world, the connection between the moon and madness was not forgotten. Newspapers printed strange stories. Crime wave that seemed to spike during the full moon. Suicides that clustered around its peak. Policemen and doctors were interviewed. Some dismissed it as coincidence. Others hinted that there might be something to it. Anecdotes piled atop anecdotes. A nurse in Edinburgh claimed that no fewer than 6 of her patients suffered episodes during the last full moon. A doctor in New York said he could feel it himself, in his blood, in his sleep, in the way the city felt just a little louder on those nights. And the language reflected this enduring belief. The term lunatic was still in use, both officially and colloquially. Laws refer to those of unsound mind as lunatics, a word that carried with the weight of centuries. Even as science advanced, the old moon-bound vocabulary remained. In literature, too, the moon retained its place as a symbol of madness. Poets wrote of silver madness, of the night's eye, of the way moonlight softened the line between dream and waking. The moon was no longer a deity, but it had not become just a rock. It remained something else, something between science and superstition, something that could not quite be pinned down. In this age of asylums, of locked doors and whispered prayers, of cold hands and sleepless nights, the moon continued to glow without mercy. It watched from above as men and women were labeled, treated, forgotten. It slid silently over rooftops and bars, over beds where the restless lay staring up at it with eyes wide open. And though no doctor could prove it, and no medicine could block it, the moon still reached down into those narrow beds and turned the soul like a tide. And so the pattern endured. The world modernized. The asylums filled. But the moon remained. A quiet accomplice. A pale witness. A force that, for all its distance, still seemed to know the names of the lost. And as the century turned once more and the gates of the asylum slowly began to open, letting the misunderstood back into a world newly shaped by psychology and modern medicine, the question remained, what did the moon really do? Did it stir madness, or simply shine a light on it? And as the science turned toward brainwaves and sleep cycles, a new chapter began, one where the moon's effect was not just seen, but felt in laboratories and bedrooms alike. As the new century unfolded its trembling fingers into the electric glow of modernity, the world began to shift once more, not with a slow churn of kingdoms and plagues, but with a fast pulse of industry, speed, and light. No longer were cities dim and hushed at night. They pulsed with street lamps and telephones, with factory whistles and midnight trains. The moon, once the brightest thing in the sky, now competed with neon and incandescent glare. Its light washed in across the rooftops of apartment blocks and the chrome curves of motor cars. But even as its power over the darkness waned, its pull on the human imagination, and perhaps on the human mind, remained just as strong, if not stronger, for the more the world believed itself free from ancient fears, the more those fears slipped beneath the surface, quiet but persistent, like an echo buried in the bones. And so the scientists came, not cloaked in robes or muttering Latin, but in lab coats with clipboards, in glasses smudged from hours of observation, armed not with chants or herbs, but with instruments, electrodes, journals, and tests. Psychology was now a science, not a mystery, and minds would be studied, not feared. Asylums were no longer dark fortresses on a hill, but gradually reshaped into clinics and wards, where behavior could be charted, quantified, understood. The word lunatic fell slowly from official use, replaced with diagnoses meant to be precise, though the old connotations never quite faded. Still, something persisted, something that pulled at the edge of every data set, something no statistic could completely smooth away. And it was this: again and again, people still went mad during the full moon. Not everyone, of course, but often enough to warrant notice. Hospitals, modern ones, lit and staffed and stocked with sedatives and schedules, reported a rise in admissions during certain lunar phases, most notably the full moon. Emergency rooms noted more violent outbursts, more injuries attributed to odd behavior. Police logs in cities across continents recorded small spikes in calls, in disturbances, in erratic acts committed not by criminals, but by people who could not explain what had come over them. And though many scientists dismissed it as coincidence, as confirmation bias, as folklore clinging to the sides of clinical walls, a quiet portion of the field began to wonder, what if the connection was real? What if something subtle, something delicate, remained between the moon and the mind? Studies began to emerge, not all conclusive, not all aligned. Some found no correlation at all, and others found patterns too weak to claim as fact. But some, more carefully constructed, began to suggest a faint but consistent rhythm, that sleep cycles were slightly disrupted during the full moon, that brainwave activity shifted ever so slightly, that melatonin levels, the hormone that governs sleep and circadian rhythms, dropped during those bright nights. The body, it seemed, did not entirely ignore the moon. Even if the conscious mind did not stir at the sight of it, the deeper processes, the quiet machinery of thought and rest and regulation, still seemed to sense that silver light. Sleep laboratories, with their softly humming machines and padded, sterile chambers, began to track volunteers through lunar phases. Night after night, data was collected. Eye movement, muscle tension, hormonal changes. And though the results were not always dramatic, the trend in some cases was consistent. During full moons, people took longer to fall asleep. Their rest was lighter. Their dreams were more vivid. And some, when asked the next morning, reported a strange restlessness they could not explain, a feeling of having been watched or visited or stirred awake by something just beyond the reach of language. The moon's light, though no longer feared as divine or damning, still reached the closed eyelids of sleepers. Even behind curtains, even through glass, it found a way to enter. Photons, those ancient messengers of the stars, triggered receptors in skin and eyes, sending subtle signals to the brain. Perhaps this was all it was, just light interfering with biology. Perhaps the ancient fear was no more than a chain reaction begun by brightness, disrupting melatonin, altering mood, and disturbing dreams. But if it were only that, why did it linger so deeply? Why did the full moon still hold the attention of the restless, the lonely, the sleepless? Why did emergency rooms still prepare for busy nights, even in the age of data? Some psychiatrists began to speak cautiously of lunar sensitivity, a term broad enough to be safe, vague enough to carry no accusations of superstition. It allowed for the possibility that, like the tides and the seeds and the migratory birds, the human mind might still be just slightly aligned with the rhythms of the sky, that perhaps evolution had not erased that awareness, but merely buried it beneath the noise of modern life. And in this framework, the madness of the moon was not mystical. It was environmental, biological, neurological. The stories of old were not wrong, just misunderstood. But while the scientists and doctors debated behind their quiet desks, the world outside kept turning. People still woke in the night without reason, still found themselves more irritable, more anxious, more alert when the moon was full. Artists still painted the moon with reverence. Poets still wrote of lunacy and longing, and storytellers still spoke of transformations, of secrets kept beneath silver light. Horror films use a full moon as a backdrop for terror, not because it was scientific, but because it felt true. And in that feeling, unprovable, undeniable, there was something deeply human. And so the modern world, filled with streetlights and schedules, with measured days and medicated nights, continued to live in quiet conversation with the moon. It no longer bowed to it, no longer blamed it for illness or fate, but still watched it, still marked its rise, still noted, silently, the days when the moon was full. Hospitals, though they may not say so aloud, often staffed more heavily on those nights. Police departments, in some cities, still kept watch with extra care, and individuals, in apartments high above the city or in houses surrounded by woods, still sometimes paused at the window, staring out at that round white eye in the sky, wondering, perhaps, why they could not sleep. The moon, for its part, remained unchanged. It did not know or care what science said. It did not need belief or disbelief to shine. It rose as it always had, quiet, cold, indifferent, moving across the heavens not for us, but with us, its path eternal, its phases older than language. And in that stillness, in that silence, it offered not answers, but reflection, a mirror not just to the sun, but to ourselves, our fears, our stories, our strange and delicate minds. And perhaps, as the decades marched onward and technology brought us even closer to the stars, the moon would offer something else, not madness, but memory. A memory of what it meant to be vulnerable to the night, to feel the pull of light that was not ours, to fear and to wonder in equal measure. And even as neuroscience advanced, mapping the mind in finer and finer detail, the question would remain, was it the moon that changed us, or simply the light that reminded us what we already were? And in the quiet bedrooms of the world, where the sleepless tossed gently and the clocks ticked softly on, the answer would not come in words or studies, but in a feeling, an ancient, echoing feeling, that somewhere above, the moon was watching, not to harm, not to help, just to be. And in that being, something inside us shifted, as it always had, as it always would. Even as laboratories hummed softly with machines tracking brainwaves in dimly lit sleep studies, even as psychiatrists carefully typed their findings into sterile clinical reports, the moon continued to cast its long, ancient shadow not only over the hearts and minds of individuals, but also across the solemn chambers of law, those cold, echoing halls where truth is debated, weighed, and ultimately declared in binding, human words. For while science sought to quantify the moon's pull and art sought to describe it, the law, bound to precedent and shaped by history, found itself facing a stranger task. How to judge what could not be entirely explained. How to account for madness when it came not in waves of logic but in tides of lunar light. It is a strange thing to consider that the phases of the moon, ancient and silent, could have once been summoned in defense of human behavior, cited in courtrooms where robed judges presided with grave expressions and juries listened with uneasy ears. Yet across centuries and continents, that is precisely what occurred. From medieval tribunals held beneath oak rafters and flickering torches, to modern courtrooms paneled in polished wood and buzzing with fluorescent light, the claim returned again and again that something within the accused changed during the full moon, that the crime, violent, bizarre, or inexplicable, was committed not by a rational self, but by a mind momentarily unmoored, pulled off its axis by forces greater than understanding. In English law, long before modern psychiatry gave shape to terms like dissociative states or psychotic breaks, the term non compos mentis, not a sound mind, was used to excuse or mitigate certain crimes. But alongside this, another word hovered, wrapped in centuries of superstition and fear, lunaticus, the moonstruck. And while non compos implied a permanent, disabling madness, lunaticus suggested something far more fluid, something cyclical, something that could come and go with the waxing and waning of the moon. It was this idea that haunted legal proceedings, that the full moon could temporarily eclipse a person's reason, lifting the veil of self-control, causing acts so strange they could not be believed to belong to the person who committed them. In some cases, these defenses were successful. Judges, especially in earlier centuries, often came from backgrounds steeped in the same folk beliefs as those they judged. A man who murdered his neighbor during a full moon, but had lived peaceably for years, might be seen not as a cold killer, but as a vessel, temporarily overcome. Testimony would be given about his behavior during previous lunar cycles, whether he had shown signs of instability, of sleepwalking, of visions, or fears. Neighbors might speak of his pale face and distant eyes, of how he once stood in the fields at night speaking to the air. And if the timing aligned with the moon's fullness, a seed of doubt will be planted, subtle but persistent. Perhaps, the court might conclude, the crime was not entirely his own. One such case occurred in the early 18th century, when a woman in Wiltshire was accused of setting fire to her own cottage with her children inside. When questioned, she wept, unable to explain her actions, speaking only of the moonlight that had told her secrets the night before. Witnesses claimed she had not slept for days leading up to the fire, had been seen wandering barefoot in the garden, staring at the sky. The jury, though horrified, returned a verdict of lunacy rather than guilt, and she was sent not to the gallows but to a private institution. Her case was whispered about for years afterward, not as a crime, but as a warning. In more recent centuries, the moon continued to surface in legal arguments, less overtly perhaps, but still present. Lawyers might not claim outright that their client had been possessed by lunar forces, but they might point to sleep disorders, to sudden dissociative episodes, to unexplained rages or fugue states that just happened, coincidentally or not, to coincide with the full moon. And behind these arguments, the quiet knowledge remained that juries, even in the modern world, were still human, still shaped by stories heard in childhood, still susceptible to the subtle rhythm of unease that rose each month with the moon's fullness. There were even jurisdictions where police departments noted an increase in emergency calls during full moons. In some towns, extra patrols were assigned, not officially because of lunar belief, but out of custom, out of caution, out of something no one wanted to name too loudly. Hospital staff, too, often whispered that the full moon brought busier nights, more stabbings, more car accidents, more domestic disturbances. And while some studies failed to prove a strong correlation, the stories remained, because belief, once woven into the fabric of a culture, does not vanish with the publication of a paper. It lingers in practice, in habit, in the silent expectations that shape action without ever being spoken. In the late 20th century, several high-profile criminal cases brought the moon back into legal discourse, sometimes seriously, sometimes with a hint of absurdity. In one case in the American Midwest, a man accused of violent assault claimed that he had no memory of the attack, and that his sleep disorder, linked, according to his lawyer, to cycles of full moon, rendered him not responsible. Experts were brought in. Some dismissed the claim outright. Others, more cautiously, acknowledged that in rare individuals, environmental triggers could indeed exacerbate underlying neurological conditions. The jury, faced with the mystery of science and the weight of suffering, deliberated for days before reaching a verdict of diminished capacity. But beyond the cases themselves, beyond the verdicts and headlines, there remains something quieter, something more telling. The fact that the moon still appears in the margins of law, not as a statute, not as a formal rule, but as an idea, a possibility. That behavior might be influenced by the sky, that the rhythms of the heavens could be echoed, however faintly, in the chambers of the mind. And in a world that believes itself ruled by logic and reason, that possibility still has power. Because even judges, even jurors, even prosecutors and defenders, all of them, like the rest of us, are human. They too have stood at windows, sleepless beneath the moon. They too have felt that strange shiver, that quickening of breath, that flicker of unease when the night feels too bright. And though they may not admit it, may not even realize it, the stories they heard as children of wolves and wanderers, of madness and moonlight, still echo somewhere deep inside. The courtroom may be lit by fluorescent lights, but outside, the moon still waits, still watches. And so, as law continues to evolve, as mental health is more fully understood, and as science continues to dig deeper into the brain's secret workings, the moon remains, not as a defendant, not as a witness, but as a presence, silent, above, unblinking. It will not testify. It cannot be cross-examined. But its influence, real or imagined, lingers still. And in this lingering lies a question that even the most rational minds cannot fully shake. When the moon is full, what shifts within us? What boundaries blur? What ancient tide begins to rise? And so the moon, never accused yet always suspected, continued its eternal procession above a world that changed with every passing year but never ceased. Even for a moment, to notice its light. Beyond the courtrooms and the clinics, outside the laboratories and lecture halls, the moon remained a witness to the hours when the world grew strange. When streets emptied and shadows lengthened, when doors were locked not out of superstition, but out of something more primal, something that whispered, even now, that the night was not entirely safe. And in those moments when the moon was full, when its pale light spilled unfiltered over rooftops and alleyways, fields and forests, something ancient seemed to stir again, not in the moon itself, which remained silent and indifferent, but in the hearts of those who could feel its presence deep in their blood. It was in these hours, bathed in silver light and softened by silence, that certain crimes unfolded. Crimes that baffled, unnerved, and lingered long after the last footprint was erased by rain or the final candle was extinguished in a grieving home. They were not ordinary crimes, not simply theft or jealousy, not matters of money or vengeance or convenience. These were acts that seemed to bloom out of nowhere, with no clear motive and no clear suspect. Acts that defied explanation not only because of their horror, but because of their timing, always during the full moon. These patterns, though sometimes dismissed, were quietly tracked by those who worked in the night. Constables, morticians, weary reporters who had seen too much and believed too little, but still kept a special pen for strange cases. The ones that didn't fit. There are records, still buried in dusty archives and yellowing police files, of cases closed without conclusion, murders without suspects, vanishings without witnesses, incidents so eerie and directionless that the investigating officers themselves felt a chill as they wrote their reports. Some of these cases were never connected publicly to the moon, but those who worked them, those who remembered the scent of the night air and the peculiar stillness of the scene, often noted the date, and in doing so, noted the phase of the moon, not because they believed in folklore, but because they had seen it enough times to wonder. One such case, nearly forgotten now, occurred in a rural village in northern France at the turn of the 20th century. A family of 5 was found missing from their cottage. No signs of struggle, no blood, no valuables taken. Just an empty house, a still warm hearth, and a set of muddy footprints leading from the threshold to the edge of the woods, where they vanished completely. The local priest, who had known the family since they were children, swore he had seen him at evening mass the night before, smiling and whole. That night had been bright as day, the full moon rising over the hills like a coin in a dark well. The villagers spoke little of it after, and eventually, a new family moved in, the mystery tucked away like so many others, but those who were there never forgot. They did not walk alone on full moon nights again. Another report, more modern and detailed, came from a quiet town in Canada, where a man was found wandering a frozen park, barefoot and trembling, with dried blood beneath his fingernails and no memory of who he was or how he came to be there. When police questioned him, he offered only one phrase again and again, almost in reverence. The moon was too close. His fingerprints matched no known record. His clothes bore no labels. And after 3 days in custody, he disappeared from his hospital bed without disturbing a single sheet. Security footage showed nothing. His room had no window. Yet the nurses swore they had seen moonlight on his face. And then there were the crimes that were solved, but whose solutions raised more questions than they answered. In one instance, a young woman in Wales confessed to setting fire to a barn that belonged to her childhood friend. When asked why, she replied with flat, detached voice that she felt the moon was inside her chest. Her diary, recovered after the arrest, was filled with careful observations of the lunar phases, each full moon marked with red ink, followed by pages of erratic, almost poetic entries, ramblings about time bending, about wolves without fur, about her own face shifting when she looked into mirrors. Her psychiatrist called it a rare form of psychosis, triggered by seasonal affective changes. Her lawyer suggested trauma, but neither explanation erased the fact that she had predicted the fire in her diary. 3 full moons before it happened, these stories, while scattered and unique, formed a strange, invisible constellation of their own, points of darkness bound together by the soft arc of moonlight. They were never enough to form a theory, never enough to bring science to its knees or force policy to change. But they were enough to seed doubt, enough to keep certain old beliefs alive, enough to make even the most rational investigator pause when a case arrived with no answers and a full moon overhead. There were those, even in modern times, who began to collect such cases, not formally, not as academics or officials, but as archivists of the strange, retired detectives, librarians with a taste for the unexplained, psychologists who found their textbooks lacking something essential. They kept boxes and files and digital folders labeled not with names, but with dates, and when they laid them out in order, they saw the rhythm, the way the events clustered, not always, not perfectly, but persistently. They did not speak of it often, for fear of mockery or professional harm, but they watched the sky, and they wondered, even among ordinary people, those with no titles, no badges, no degrees, the stories were told, quietly, around tables and campfires, at weddings or funerals when the air grew still and conversation turned inward. I don't know if I believe in that stuff, someone would say, but I'll tell you what happened to me, and out would come the story. The strange feeling, the odd coincidence, the night they felt eyes on them with no one there, the moment their pet growled at nothing, the dream they had the night before their uncle died, the way the room felt like it tilted slightly when they opened the curtains to the full moon. These were not confessions, not warnings, just offerings, tokens of shared uncertainty, reminders that even in the age of satellites and psychology, the moon still held a part of us, a sliver of the irrational, the intuitive, the inexplicable, the part of the mind that doesn't ask for proof but listens for the quiet hum beneath reason, the one that whispers, when the shadows stretch long and the air goes still, that something is watching, and perhaps that something is not malicious, not even sentient. Perhaps it is only light. But even light, in the right moment, can change everything. And so, as the full moon rises over cities and fields, over highways and rivers, over apartment towers and lonely farmhouses, there's always a chance, slim, invisible, unprovable, that somewhere someone will feel it too strongly, will lose their way, will act not out of will, but out of something older, and in the morning they will have no words, only silence, and the moon, now waning, will drift on, offering no explanation, only light. And so we come to those strange wanderers of night, the sleepwalkers, the moon-bound minds who, though their bodies move with intention and pace, travel to the world as if guided by unseen threads, drawn by forces too subtle to name, too ancient to understand. They were not mad in the usual sense, nor dangerous by design, but still they stirred unease in those who watched them, for there was something unnatural in their quiet movements, something uncanny in the way their limbs obeyed a logic not their own, in how they opened doors with calm precision, descended stairs without fear, and stepped into moonlight with eyes wide open and yet utterly blind. For centuries they were whispered about in stories, feared in secret, and watched with careful silence by those who shared a house with them, afraid to speak too loudly or touch them too suddenly, as if their very presence might break the spell and shatter the strange bridge between dream and waking. Sleepwalking has always existed in the human experience, called many things across cultures and eras, sometimes explained as a spiritual journey, sometimes as demonic possession, sometimes simply as an odd but harmless quirk of the mind. But there was one thing nearly all accounts had in common: the moon. Time and again, when the old stories were retold, when the diaries were reread and the testimonies collected, a pattern emerged. These nocturnal wanderings so often happened beneath the glow of the full moon, during nights when the silver light slipped through windows and stretched long across bedroom floors, painting hallways and rooftops in cold, pale luminescence. People would describe waking to find a loved one standing silently in the garden, barefoot in the frost, or climbing onto the roof without expression, or rearranging household objects with eerie focus, all without memory, without intent, as if led by something greater than themselves. The earliest recorded cases appear in ancient texts tucked between medical advice and omens, account of individuals who could not be trusted to remain still during the night, who had to be watched, not because they were dangerous, but because they might disappear. Roman physicians believed sleepwalkers were possessed by lunar spirits and advised tethering them to their beds with soft cloth so as not to anger the gods. In medieval Europe, it was thought that sleepwalkers were reliving events from past lives, walking roads long since buried or opening doors that no longer existed. Families kept quiet about such things, for fear that neighbors would see the behavior as a sign of demonic influence or hidden madness. But still the stories were passed on, whispered from parent to child. Do not leave the windows open during a full moon. Do not let your brother sleep alone on those nights. Do not follow someone if they walk into the woods while dreaming. As understanding of the body advanced, and science gained firmer footing, sleepwalking came to be explained more formally, if not more clearly. It was called somnambulism, a disorder of arousal, a state in which the sleeper is neither fully awake nor fully dreaming. But despite this medical framing, the mystery remained, for what science could not easily explain was the timing. Why some individuals only walk beneath the full moon, why others seem to be triggered by that specific phase alone, and why, even now, many sleepwalkers describe feelings of heightened energy or strange awareness just before those bright nights arrive. Sleep specialists began to study these rhythms more closely, noting the alignment between lunar phases and sleepwalking incidents, cataloging stories that echo one another across countries and cultures. One researcher in Sweden recorded 30 cases of sleepwalking over 6 months and found that 22 of them occurred within 2 days of the full moon. The data was not conclusive, but it was suggestive, just enough to keep the question alive. Modern sleep labs, equipped with wires and monitors and softly blinking machines, have captured sleepwalkers in the act, showing the slow rise from bed, the vacant stare, the purposeful steps toward doors or windows or open spaces. And still, even under the fluorescent lights of observation rooms, there is something about the footage that feels otherworldly. Doctors speak of brainwaves misfiring, of incomplete arousal states, of neural pathways confused by partial wakefulness. But those who witness it in person often describe a different feeling. The sensation that the sleeper is being drawn, not pushed, not startled, but gently pulled like a tide moving beneath the skin. And when the timing is right, when the calendar shows a full moon, the unease only deepens. Parents of sleepwalking children often become quiet experts in the matter, noting patterns, making changes, taking precautions. Some draw the curtains thick on moonlit nights. Some keep chimes on the bedroom doors, not to frighten the child, but to wake themselves as they begin to wander. And always at the heart of the concern lies that old, enduring image. A child standing in the pale light of full moon, eyes open but unseeing, mouth closed but dreaming of something vast and silent. There is something deeply haunting in that sight, not because the child is dangerous, but because it suggests a doorway that remains half open, a place where the waking world and the dreaming one still blur together under the silver gaze of the sky. In some cultures, sleepwalkers are still considered touched by something sacred. In rural areas of South America, they are believed to be luna viajantes, moon travelers, souls who drift while their bodies follow, who return the morning slightly changed. In parts of rural Asia, charms are placed above doorways not to stop the sleepwalker, but to guide them gently back. And in the far northern territories, where nights can stretch into weeks, stories abound of those who walk for miles during the moon's fullness, only to return with no memory and no injury, as if the snow itself had welcomed them. And yet, despite all these stories, despite all the old warnings and new studies, we still do not know why the moon seems to speak to sleepwalkers more clearly than others. Perhaps it is the brightness, more light slipping through closed eyelids. Perhaps it is a deeper rhythm, buried in the oldest parts of the brain, a cycle that predates language and still listens to the pull of celestial bodies. Or perhaps it is nothing more than coincidence, the clustering of events that feel meaningful only because we seek patterns in the dark. But if that were true, if it were only coincidence, why do so many sleepwalkers wake just as the moon begins to wane? Why do they feel the difference in their skin, even if they do not know the date? There is something in the stillness of a sleepwalking figure that seems to echo the moon itself. Quiet, pale, unwavering, moving not with intent but with inevitability. And those who watch a loved one glide silently through a house bathed in lunar light will tell you, it is not like watching someone lost. It is like watching someone called. And when they return to their beds, slipping beneath blankets without ever truly waking, there remains in the air a faint trace of something. Not fear exactly, but reverence, as if the night itself has brushed past you and gone on its way. And outside, high above the rooftops and trees, the moon drifts on in silence, watching the sleepers as it always has, watching those who walk, and those who wait, not intervening, not speaking, just shining. And while the sleepwalkers roamed the shadowed corridors of night with open eyes and dreaming minds, tethered softly to the unseen rhythms of the moon, there were countless others who did not move at all, and yet journeyed farther still, drifting in stillness to the vast and unknowable terrain of dreams. For even in the stillest of bodies, in the quietest of rooms, the dreamer is never truly still. There, beneath closed lids and a rise and fall of sleeping breath, whole landscapes rise like mist, fading in and out, shifting with emotion and memory and the mysterious logic of the subconscious. And always, like a pale sentinel, the moon lingers on the edges of this world, not speaking, not guiding, but glowing softly over the rivers of thought and the forests of remembrance, over the quiet ruins of forgotten moments and the fleeting apparitions of imagined futures. In the land of dreams, the moon is not a phase, but presence. Throughout human history, dreams have been watched and recorded with awe. Ancient civilizations built entire philosophies around their meaning. The Egyptians carved dream instructions into stone. The Greeks believed dreams came from the gods, carried on wings into the ears of sleepers. The Mesopotamians wrote of temples built not for waking worship, but for sleep, where priests would lie down in sacred chambers and await visions that would guide kings and warn of famine. In these stories, the moon was always near, not necessarily named, but understood to be watching, a celestial eye that blinks slowly over the sleeping world. And the idea that dreams change with the moon cycle, became more vivid, more disturbing, or more prophetic during the full moon, was so common across so many lands that it ceased to be a superstition and became, instead, a quiet certainty. In medieval Europe, it was widely believed that dreams were most dangerous during the full moon, not because they predicted doom, but because they could tangle a person's soul. A dream dreamt on a moonless night might simply reflect hunger or longing or unresolved thoughts. But a dream under the full moon was thought to be different. Heavier, more potent, more real. People were advised not to sleep too deeply on such nights, or to wear sprigs of lavender beneath their pillows to ward off the influence of lunar spirits. And though science would later scoff at such notions, the practice endured, passed down in whispers, written in the margins of herbal guides and household books, kept alive not through belief alone, but through experience, because still, even centuries later, people spoke of their strangest dreams on the nights when the moon was full. And what strange dreams they were. Dreams of flying not through the sky, but across seas of silver light. Dreams in which time folded like cloth, where the past and future spoke in riddles, where familiar faces wore unfamiliar expressions and called out names never heard before. Dreams of being watched from above, not with menace, but with immense, unknowable patience. Dreams that woke people not with panic, but with awe, as if they had glimpsed something vast and wordless. Artists and poets and mystics alike describe these moonlit dreams as moments of contact, brushes against the veil, fleeting glimpses of something too large to hold. And though psychologists try to catalog and explain them, linking them to sleep cycles, to hormone fluctuations, to suppressed memories, the feeling remained that something else was at work, something older. In the late 20th century, sleep research began to pay closer attention to these phenomena. Studies were conducted in sleep laboratories across Europe and North America, using EEGs and infrared cameras to monitor not just movement, but the depth and texture of dreams. Participants were asked to keep dream journals, to describe the emotions they felt, the clarity of their images, the strangeness of the events. Again and again, a pattern emerged. During full moons, dreams were more intense, not just more frequent, but more emotionally charged, more vivid, more likely to be remembered. Some participants reported recurring themes, being pulled upward, seeing luminous paths, feeling surrounded by an unseen presence. Others described nights of emotional release, of crying in sleep without knowing why, of dreams that felt like goodbyes or homecomings. The scientists recorded the data, cautious in their conclusions, but the pattern was hard to ignore. Of course, not everyone dreamed deeply during the full moon. Some struggled to sleep at all. Insomnia rose subtly during these nights, as if the moon, shining too brightly even through drawn curtains, whispered too loudly to let the mind fully rest. But even among the sleepless, there was a kind of dreaming, a drifting state just below consciousness, where thoughts unravel and memories replayed, and fears circle like soft, slow birds. And in those half-dreams, the moon often appeared not as a cause, but as a witness, watching, waiting. Some people began to lean into the practice of lunar dreaming. They created rituals, not out of superstition, but out of reverence for the mystery. On full moon nights, they would light candles, burn soft-scented herbs, write intentions or questions in journals, and place them beneath pillows in the hope that the dream world would respond. They called it moon dreaming. Not magic, exactly, but a way of listening, a way of aligning the internal tides with the lunar pull. And whether the results came from psychology or something less easily defined, the dreams that followed often felt more significant, more like messages, more like stories told not by the self, but by the night. And the moon, as always, remained silent. It did not give answers, nor ask questions. It simply illuminated. It cast light across the dreamscape, soft and merciless, revealing not just what was hidden in shadow, but what was hidden in light. For sometimes, the hardest truths are those we cannot look at directly, and dreams allow us to approach them sideways, cloaked in symbols, disguised as strangers. And the moon, reflecting the sun's harshness into something gentler, seemed to understand that. It made the unbearable visible, the unspoken speakable. Even now, in a world awash in artificial light and digital noise, where sleep is often shallow and dreams fragmented, there are those who wake after a full moon night with the sense that they have traveled far. They cannot always describe where they've been, but they feel the weight of the journey in their bones, the echo of meaning that slips away on waking, but leaves behind a stillness, like the hush after a cathedral bell. And they find in their journals or in their hearts a quiet certainty that something was revealed, something that will unfold in time, like the slow waning of the moon itself. So the dreamers continue to lie in beds across the world, on nights both moonless and moonlit, eyes closed, breathing even, minds adrift. And the moon continues its ancient arc overhead, tracing the same path it has since before memory, bathing sleepers in its cool, patient glow, not to intrude, not to command, but to be present, to accompany, to light the road, not with direction, but with possibility. And in that soft light, the dreams come, not always understood, not always kind, but always honest. And when morning arrives, as the moon slips once more below the horizon and the world stirs into wakefulness, the dreamers rise, stretch, blink against the daylight, and carry something with them, not a vision, perhaps, not a message, but a feeling, a trace of something not entirely lost. And they glance, without quite knowing why, at the pale place in the sky where the moon once hung, and they nod, almost imperceptibly, as if to thank it, for being there, for watching, for dreaming alongside them. And while the moon casts its silver light upon the dreaming minds of sleepers, drawing from them visions and stories spun of memory and mystery, it also reached out beyond the private realm of sleep and into the realm of creation, the realm where thoughts were given shape in ink, in sound, in color and movement, in the delicate human impulse to make something from the unseen. For if the moon could not speak in words, if it could not explain its presence or justify its power, then it would instead leave traces in the hands of artists, in the aching strings of musicians, in the brushstrokes that lingered long after the moon had set, and in the pages of poetry so soft and strange they seemed to hum with lunar breath. From the very beginning, long before names were written in history and long before galleries or stages had been built, humans turned their gaze upward and drew what they saw, on cave walls beneath flickering torches. Someone once carved the simple curve of a crescent, marking not a calendar but a feeling, not a measurement but a reverence. That curve would appear again and again throughout time, on pottery and fabric, in stone and paint and song, a gentle arc that came to mean more than a celestial body. It came to mean longing, wonder, madness, beauty, a slow, impossible truth glimpsed only in darkness. And artists, more than most, seem to feel its pull. In the quiet hours of night, when cities hush and the world feels less crowded, painters have long stood before their canvases, the room lit not by lamps but by moonlight alone, their eyes reflecting the same pale blue-white as the sky beyond their windows. The moon has not merely been a subject of their work. It has been a companion, a mirror. Vincent van Gogh, in one of his many sleepless nights, wrote of the moon as something that lived within him not above him. He did not just paint the moon. He painted its trembling in his soul, its spiraling in his blood. The swirls of the sky were not literal. They were emotional truths, rendered with hands that understood that the moon was not an object, but a presence, a witness, a weight, and it was not only the painters. The poets, too, were drawn to it, their pens moving slowly across paper late into the night, stirred by something they could not fully name. Shelley called the moon the lamp of heaven, a watcher of mortality. Wordsworth, walking beneath its glow, found in it a comfort too deep for speech. Emily Dickinson, from her quiet room in Amherst, described the moon as a ghost, a silent traveler, and yet also a friend, an echo of the self. These were not rational comparisons. They were emotional truths, spoken in symbols, in rhythm, in the hush between lines. And then, of course, came the music, the strange, haunting music of the moon, written not in the sky but in the space between notes. Ludwig van Beethoven, half-deaf and filled with turmoil, composed his Moonlight Sonata not for the moon itself, but for the feeling it stirred, the ache of distance, the shimmer of reflection. And yet, when listeners heard it, they heard moonlight, not because the music described it, but because it evoked it. Those trembling arpeggios like ripples on a silver lake, those low, echoing chords like clouds passing slowly over a full moon. And in that listening, people found not understanding, but recognition. Something inside them nodded quietly, and they let themselves drift. Over time, entire genres will be devoted to the moon, not just in title or theme, but in tone. Lunar music came to mean something slow, melancholic, unhurried, rich with atmosphere. Songs about the moon were rarely joyous. They were wistful, reflective. They spoke of longing, of absence, of beauty that cannot be held. And always, somewhere beneath the melody, there was a faint suggestion of madness. Not loud or wild, but the kind of madness that comes from too much feeling, too much looking inward, too much silence. The kind that artists have always known well. For the moon's influence is not only gentle, it is also unsettling. It stirs things that do not always wish to be stirred. It awakens beauty, yes, but also sorrow, fear, obsession. And many artists, driven by that call, have walked the edge between brilliance and collapse. They wandered too far into the quiet, stayed too long in the glow, and when they returned, they brought with them visions too raw, too luminous, too fractured to be understood fully. Some called them geniuses, others called them mad. The connection between creativity and madness is not new. It has been studied, debated, romanticized, feared. But always, in those discussions, the moon lingers like a ghost at the edge of the conversation. Why is it that so many who create do so by moonlight? Why do the hours between midnight and dawn call to the writer more than the afternoon ever could? Why do so many songs of heartbreak and transcendence mention the moon, not as metaphor, but as presence, as something that was there when the song was written, when the heart broke, when the soul cried out? Some psychologists believe the answer lies in sleep cycles, in the altered states of the mind as it grows tired. Others point to solitude of night, to the stillness that allows deeper thoughts to surface. But others, especially those who have lived through it, who have stood at the easel at 3 a.m. or sat at the piano long after the world has gone quiet, know that it is more than that. The moon does not just witness creativity. It evokes it. Its light is not merely illumination. It is invitation. And for some, the invitation becomes too much. The moon has always been associated with madness, not the chaos of rage, but the unraveling of boundaries, the blurring of the self, the gentle, terrible slipping away from what is known into what is felt. Many artists have welcomed this. Others have feared it, and some have been broken by it. The poet Gerard Manley Hopkins spoke of the mind's moonlight, a state where thoughts shimmered but could not be held. Virginia Woolf, whose genius was matched only by her sorrow, described the moon as something that watched too closely, too knowingly, and in the end, she too walked into the water under a sky that held the moon like an eye. And yet, even knowing the cost, the moon continues to call to the artist, because the creator is, in a way, to go mad for a time, to leave the ordinary world, to dwell in vision and possibility. And the moon, with its silence, its distance, its impossible beauty, offers both permission and provocation. It does not demand that we understand it, only that we feel it, that we answer. And so, across the centuries, across cultures and mediums and languages, the moon has remained the artist's companion. Its light falls softly on notebooks and canvases, on pianos and stages. It slips into the background of films, into the refrains of love songs, into the closing lines of whispered poems. It does not change what is created. It changes how it is received. It adds depth, mystery, weight, and somewhere deep in the listener or the viewer or the reader, something ancient stirs in response. Not understanding, not agreement, just the quiet acknowledgement of recognition, of having seen that same light, of having felt that same pull. And as the artist finally puts down the brush or closes a notebook or steps away from the piano, the moon still waits outside the window, unmoved, unchanged. It will rise again tomorrow. It will shine on someone else, and someone else will answer. And if the artist sees in the moon a kind of echo, a silent muse that draws forth beauty wrapped in mystery, then the mind, already cracked, already delicate with too much thought or too little peace, may see in that same moon not inspiration but fracture, may feel not comfort but an eerie, magnetic disturbance, as if the silver light presses into the very nerves and fibers of thought and pries loose the thin cords holding the self together. For there is something about the full moon, in particular, that seems to reach more deeply into the fragile human mind, not with violence or volume, but with stillness, with relentless presence. It does not scream or strike. It simply is. And in that unwavering brightness, those who carry their pain like a cup filled to the brim find themselves trembling at the edge, a single tremor away from spilling over. It is no wonder, then, that in psychiatric records stretching back centuries, through asylum ledgers written in careful cursive and doctor's notes stained with age and sorrow, the full moon makes quiet appearances again and again, not as a cause, not even as a symptom, but as a presence noted by those who observe patterns too subtle to prove, but too consistent to ignore. A patient who had been calm for weeks would suddenly pace the floor for hours during a full moon, their hands wringing, their mouth whispering to people no one else could see. Another would fall into deep silence, eyes fixed on a window, unmoving, breathing slow and steady, as if waiting for some answer to arrive on a beam of pale light. Nurses would mark it quietly. Incident occurred during full moon, and while administrators might dismiss the note as incidental, those who sat through the nights, who held hands, who cleaned wounds, who listened to monologues unraveling like old thread knew better. They felt it, too. In the dim corridors of old institutions, where shadows were long and the walls held the residue of years, patients sometimes spoke of the moon in voices filled with awe or fear, or both. They called it a doorway, a watcher, a mother, a flame. One man, institutionalized for hallucinations no one could understand, told a psychiatrist that the moon was not the moon at all but a mirror, and that every full moon showed not just the sky, but all the minds in the world turned inside out. When asked what he meant, he simply smiled and said, "It shows what's hidden." And though the doctor wrote it off as a delusion, he also began quietly to draw the curtains on nights when the moon was full. There were others in other places, quiet people with delicate minds, untroubled by grand diagnoses or dangerous behavior, who nonetheless felt something shift in their inner world when the full moon rose. They would speak of racing thoughts, of dreams that did not fade, of memories returning like waves, sudden and sharp. Some described a sense of not being entirely themselves, as if their thoughts were not anchored, as if their center had slipped a few degrees off its usual mark. These were not loud symptoms. They were murmurs, but they were real. And though the textbooks rarely mentioned the moon, the patients did, again and again. And so a quiet question emerged, one without clear language or a home in the diagnostic manuals. Does the moon, in its fullness, exert pressure not on the world but on the self? Not physically, perhaps, but symbolically, psychologically, emotionally? Is there, in its brightness, a kind of exposure? A flooding of the darkened inner rooms that most of us keep shuttered and silent? When the moon is full, nothing is hidden outside. Could it be that something inside us opens, too? To explore such a question is to wander into difficult terrain. The mind is a forest, thick with underbrush, and the line between symbol and symptom is often thin. moving, vanishing when touched. Yet it is clear from journals and interviews and a long, slow accumulation of whispered testimony that the full moon has long acted as a kind of emotional amplifier. Whatever is already present, grief, anxiety, joy, despair, seems to ring louder in the hours of its dominance. It is not the cause, perhaps, but the conductor, the magnifier, the trigger. Even those without formal diagnoses speak of it. Those who live with anxiety say their hearts race faster during full moon, though nothing in their day has changed. Those who suffer from depression say their sleep grows more restless, their thoughts more circling. And those with no words for what they feel, only the soft ache of being alive, find themselves crying for no reason under the moon's pale glow, staring out the window and wondering why the world feels too large, too sharp, too tender to bear. They do not know why, only that it happens. And science, slow and careful, has begun to listen. Some researchers have found tentative links between lunar phases and hospital admissions for psychiatric distress. Others have studied fluctuations in melatonin and serotonin, the body's quiet chemicals of sleep and mood, and have found changes that correlate subtly with the moon cycle. These findings are not conclusive. They are soft data, whispers rather than declarations. But still they echo what has been felt for so long. Perhaps the truth is that we are creatures of rhythm. Our hearts beat in time. Our lungs rise and fall. Our bodies follow the pull of the tides, the cycles of day and night, hunger and rest, grief and grace. And the moon, constant yet ever-changing, offers one of the oldest rhythms of all. When it is full, it is not simply brighter, it is complete. It is at its peak. And we, too, feel that peak in our own quiet ways. For some, it is a surge of energy. For others, a tremor in the mind. For a few, it is a cracking open of something long held shut. There is a kind of beauty in this, even in the pain, a reminder that we are not separate from the world, but made of it, that the light in the sky touches more than the earth. It touches thought, memory, emotion, and while the mind may fracture under that light, it also reveals things that might otherwise remain hidden: tenderness, vulnerability, the deep need to be seen, to be soothed, to be whole. And so when the moon rises in fullness once more, when it climbs over cities and forests and fields, over homes where people sleep uneasily or weep without reason, it does not come to harm. It comes only to shine, to show, to hold. And those who struggle in its light are not alone. They are part of a story older than words. A story of minds lit by moons, of hearts pulled by tides, of people who feel too deeply and break too easily, and yet keep waking up, keep dreaming, keep looking out the night sky and whispering, "I see you." And the moon, full and silent, says nothing in return, but it glows, and for some that is enough. And if the full moon pressed softly against the edges of the mind, coaxing secrets from sleep and stirring the uneasy waters of the soul, then it also stood at the heart of rituals far older than psychology, older even than writing. Rituals born in the hush of ancient nights when firelight flickered and shadows danced across stone walls, when humankind still crouched in awe before the sky, feeling not superior to nature, but held inside it, shaped by it, obedient to its quiet and unfathomable will. The moon, with its rhythm so precise yet so mysterious, became not only a beacon but a force, a divine presence not distant and theoretical like the stars, but near and recurring, close enough to count, to mark, to name. It was the eye of the goddess, the vessel of magic, the keeper of madness and mystery alike. And in that belief, born of fear, wonder, and a hunger to understand, civilizations across the world began to build rites around the moon, offerings and dances, chants and sacrifices, each with the same purpose: to honor, to appease, to touch the unknowable. In the cradles of early civilization, along the fertile curves of the Nile, beneath the open skies of Mesopotamia, in the dense forests and mountains where tribes lit their sacred fires, the moon was not simply admired. It was woven into the very fabric of spiritual life. Lunar calendars guided planting and harvesting, yes, but they also shaped festivals, fasts, and ceremonies meant not only to please the gods, but to keep the delicate balance of the world intact. It was believed that when the moon was full, the veil between this world and the next grew thin, and through that veil could pass both blessings and dangers, spirits benign or wild, Truths too bright to bear, visions too strange to interpret. On such nights, those gifted or cursed with sensitivity would gather, their eyes glinting with moonlight, their chants rising like smoke into the air, as they danced or prayed or wept beneath that terrible, beautiful eye in the sky. In ancient Greece, the moon was personified as Selene and later as Artemis, goddesses of light, of the hunt, of female strength and wild purity. Temples of Artemis rose in groves and on hillsides, and her followers, often women deemed wild or untamed by the standards of their time, would celebrate her on the full moon. Their rituals both secret and sacred. The connection between the lunar cycle and the female body was not lost on them. In fact, it was central. The moon governed tides, but it also governed blood. To be ruled by the moon was not weakness. It was alignment, power, a direct link to the divine. And so these rites, often misunderstood by later generations as madness, were in fact acts of connection, of surrender to something vast and ancient, not out of fear, but out of reverence. But not all lunar rites were soft and serene. Some carried within them the crackling tension of madness barely held at bay. In Rome, the goddess Lunar rode her chariot across the sky, but she was cousin to Diana and Hecate, deities of the wild and the dead, of the crossroads and the unknown. During the full moon, certain rites, especially those practiced in secret by mystery cults, were said to grow more intense, more frenzied. Worshippers would enter trance states, their bodies trembling with emotion, their voices rising in chant, calling out to the moon not for peace, but for transformation. And when the rituals ended, they would collapse in exhaustion, their minds emptied, their hearts cracked open, their sense of self dissolved and reformed like molten metal. These rites were not performative. They were not theater. They were experiences meant to unmake the ego and touch something more raw. In the high mountains of the Andes, long before the arrival of European colonizers, the Inca built lunar shrines where the moon was not just a god, but a relative, a force with personality and appetite. Offerings of food, cloth, and song were made to it, not to beg for favor, but to acknowledge its presence, to keep the relationship stable. Shamans, called Pacos, watched the moon closely, reading its phases like scripture, listening for signs. It was said that during the full moon, certain individuals could receive visions from the ancestors, dreams that were not dreams but messages, fragments of prophecy whispered on silver wind. And with these visions came risk. To see too much was to be changed. To hear too clearly was to lose balance. Some who saw never returned to who they were before. And so the rites were approached with care, with deep preparation, not for spectacle, but for survival. In medieval Europe, where old pagan rites had been driven underground by rising tides of religious fear, the full moon still held sway over the folk imagination, and those accused of witchcraft were often said to meet in secret beneath its light, performing rites that blended healing with heresy. Whether these gatherings were real or imagined, whether they involved herbs or hexes or simple songs, mattered less than the fact that the moon became a symbol of otherness, of female power, of untamed energy. To dance in the moonlight became, in the eyes of some, an act of rebellion, of danger, of madness, and as the fear of heresy spread, so too did the fear of the moon. People were warned to stay indoors during full moon nights. Churches rang their bells at midnight to ward off spirits. Children were told not to look too long at the moon, lest it enter their dreams. And yet, the moon remained, indifferent to dogma, to doctrine, to dread. It watched the torches flicker. It watched the rites fade. It watched and remembered. Even today, in corners of the world where old traditions are still practiced quietly beneath electric lights and under the camouflage of modernity, lunar rites endure, not as spectacles, not as rituals written down, but as gestures passed from hand to hand, lighting a candle when the moon is full, pouring out a drink, whispering a name, taking a deep breath while standing barefoot in moonlight, not because it changes anything, but because it connects something, because in those small moments, the old memory returns that the moon is not just a rock in space. It is a presence, a rhythm, a mirror for the self. And though we no longer gather in temples or forests in great numbers, though we rarely dance until our limbs collapse or chant until our voices vanish into mist, the urge remains to mark the full moon with some kind of reverence, to stand still for a moment and remember that we are not alone in our madness or our longing, that the world itself pulses with mystery, that there are rites still unfolding, even if we do not name them as such. To look at the moon is, in a way, to participate in the oldest rite of all, the rite of witnessing, of feeling, of being moved by something larger than reason. And in that act, we are not broken. We are bound by madness, perhaps, but also by beauty. And the moon, overhead, keeps shining. It has seen every rite, every song, every trembling heart turned upward in the dark, and it remembers them all. And as the moon lingered above, a pale and silent observer to the rituals of old and the minds unraveling gently beneath its glow, there emerged in story and legend a creature said to be not merely influenced by the moon, but transformed by it, drawn from the wildness of the forest, from the old pulse of predation and the cold breath of night, a creature born of fear and fascination alike, whose very soul was said to shift when the moon grew full. The werewolf, half man, half beast, cursed or chosen depending on the tale, embodied the idea that under the light of the full moon, oneself could be entirely unmade and rebuilt into something primal, something untamed, something that answered not to law or logic, but to instinct and hunger and the ancient rhythm of the wilderness. It was not just a monster fable. It was a mirror held up to the deepest fear in the human heart. That we are not what we seem, that beneath the thin skin of civility lies something older, something wild, something waiting for the moon to call it forth. Across centuries and continents, from the misty forests of medieval Europe to the snowbound villages of northern Asia, stories emerge of men who became wolves under the full moon's light, of cursed souls who wandered the woods as beasts, returned to their homes at dawn bloodied and bewildered, with no memory of what their claws had done. These were not tales told only to frighten children, though frighten they did, but warnings, explanations for madness and violence, attempts to make sense of inexplicable horrors. A man who was kind by day but monstrous by night, who howled in his sleep and woke to find dirt beneath his fingernails and unfamiliar bruises on his skin, could be understood, if not forgiven, if he bore the mark of the wolf. And the moon, hanging above like a silver coin of fate, was both witness and accomplice, the signal that the transformation had begun. In the Middle Ages, belief in werewolves was not superstition. It was, to many, reality. Trials were held, confessions extracted, executions carried out in belief that certain men, and occasionally women, had bargained with dark forces, or been cursed by saints or spirits, and now roamed the forest as beasts during the moon's height. Some claimed to see them running naked through the fields, their limbs contorted, their eyes glowing. Others told of wolves that walked upright, that spoke with human voices, or wept after killing. And always, the full moon was part of the tale, not just as backdrop, but as cause. The moon did not merely light the way. It changed the blood. It altered the soul. And while modern science has dismissed these transformations as myth, as metaphor, there remains something persistent in the way the full moon still stirs the imagination, still pulls at the edge of logic with claws of silver and shadow. The wolf is not just an animal. It is a symbol of that which cannot be tamed, the part of the self that lurks in the dark woods of the mind, snarling softly when restrained too long. And the werewolf, in its sorrow and savagery, becomes not just a monster, but a warning that within each person there lies potential for transformation, for a shedding of identity, a return to something raw and unreasoning. The idea of the lunar curse, the notion that the moon can reach into the very core of a person and pull out something other, something animal, is ancient and not confined to Europe alone. In Norse mythology, the berserkers were warriors who wore the skins of wolves and bears, entering battle in a trance-like fury said to be triggered by rituals often performed on the full moon. In part of Africa, shape-shifting legends abound. Men who become hyenas or leopards, moving silently through the night in animal form to settle old scores or seek forbidden knowledge. In Japan, the kitsune, fox spirits, are said to reveal their true forms under the moonlight, their power waxing and waning with the lunar cycle. And in the Americas, both north and south, tribes tell of skinwalkers, beings who wear the hides of animals and take on their traits, often under the influence of celestial rhythms. In all these tales, the moon is not neutral. It is the force that activates the transformation. It is a signal that something sacred or profane is about to occur, And whether the change is sought willingly or endured in horror, it carries the same truth, that the self is not fixed, that it bends, that it can break. And there is, hidden beneath the horror, a kind of longing in these stories, a desire not just to be free from the rules of society, but to be joined with something wild and free, to feel, if only for a moment, the wind and fur, the cold of the earth beneath clawed feet, the thrill of the hunt not as cruelty, but as clarity. And perhaps that is why the myth has lasted so long, not because we fear becoming beasts, but because some part of us aches to. Even now, in modern times, when wolves are in danger in city sprawl far from the forest where such myths were born, the full moon retains its grip on this archetype. Films, books, songs, they return again and again to the werewolf, the transformation, the silver light that changes everything. It is not science, it is story. And story, as it always has, reaches the parts of us that logic cannot. Psychologists have noted that during the full moon, people report feeling more irritable, more impulsive, more energetic in ways they do not understand. Emergency rooms see a slight rise in violence, though not always enough to prove cause. Police records show spikes in certain kinds of behavior. Is it real? Is it confirmation bias? Or is it that the stories we carry shape what we become? When the moon is full, do we lean into legend consciously or not, and let the boundaries slip just a little? Whatever the answer, the image remains. The moon high overhead, the transformation underway, the quiet horror and wonder of a mind shifting into something unrecognizable. And when dawn comes and the body is found curled in dew-covered grass or in a stranger's bed or sitting quietly in the kitchen, unable to recall the night before, there is a silence, a pause, a question no one wants to ask. Who was I? And the moon, far away and fading, says nothing, but it knows. It always knows. And next month, it will return again, full and patient, ready to open the door once more. And if the full moon in all its glowing certainty brought with it stories of transformation and madness, then there were nights, rarer, stranger, when that same moon was swallowed, when its perfect silver circle turned dark, as if the sky itself had blinked or held its breath. And on those nights, even the brave grew still. The lunar eclipse, with its slow, deliberate unmaking of the moon, was never viewed as a simple astronomical event by those who looked up in ages past. It was not a shadow to be measured, but a sign to be feared. For if the full moon was constancy, then the eclipse was interruption. Cosmic silence where once there had been song, a sudden and terrifying break in the order of things. And in a world where the heavens were not separate from human fate, such a break meant more than darkness. It meant danger. Omen. Disruption on a scale too vast to name. Long before telescopes charted orbits and scientists calculated the paths of light and shadow, people gathered outside when the moon began to dim, their eyes fixed on the sky not with curiosity, but with awe laced with dread. The moon, they knew, was always there, rising and setting with a rhythm as steady as breath. It waxed and waned, it vanished and returned, but it did so gently, predictably, never all at once. And so when the eclipse came, when that glowing orb began to disappear not in part, but in whole, it was as though the heartbeat of the world had stuttered, and in that pause, anything could happen. The earth felt less safe, the air colder, the rules suspended. In ancient Babylon, skilled astronomers recorded eclipses meticulously, reading them not as accidents of geometry, but as messages from the gods. A lunar eclipse meant danger to the king, and so rituals were performed in the palace. A substitute king would be appointed, a common man dressed in royal robes, seated on the throne for the duration of the eclipse, absorbing the celestial wrath meant for the true ruler. And when the shadow passed, the real king would return, and the substitute, his role fulfilled, would quietly disappear. In this way, the balance of power was maintained, not through denial of the eclipse's power, but through ritual acknowledgement. The gods had spoken. The response was made. The world could continue. Elsewhere, in the shadowed temples of ancient India, eclipses were viewed as the work of celestial demons, Rahu and Ketu, who sought to devour the moon in vengeance and hunger. Priests and common people alike would chant and fast, bathing in rivers, ringing bells to drive the demons away. Children were brought indoors. Food was not cooked, and silence settled over the land like a second night. The belief was not just myth. but instinct, a deep communal recognition that when the moon disappeared, something inside the human heart faltered too, and when the light slowly returned, it was like breath after drowning, relief, awe, the kind that makes people weep without knowing why. The Norse spoke of wolves chasing the moon. Skoll and Hati, two monstrous beings that would one day catch and devour the sun and moon at the time of Ragnarok, the end of all things. An eclipse, then, was not merely a disruption, but a rehearsal of the apocalypse. When the moon turned red, blood moon, they called it, it was a warning. And so the people would make noise, shouting, banging drums, shooting arrows skyward. Not because they believed it would stop the wolves, but because not to respond would mean accepting the end. And even those who believe the old myths only half would find themselves raising their voices in night, hearts pounding, hands trembling, not out of logic, but out of something older, something deeper. In Mesoamerican cultures, the Maya and the Inca, eclipses were not just disruptions in the sky, but portals, moments when a veil between worlds thinned and spirits could cross freely. Shamans would don special garments, paint their faces, burn incense that clung to the lungs like ancient breath. They would enter trance states, their bodies swaying like reeds in windless water, and speak with voices not entirely their own. The moon's disappearance was not just a sign. It was an opening, a crack in the dome of heaven. And with that crack came possibility and peril both. The dead could return. The future could be glimpsed. Madness could slip in unnoticed, quiet and permanent. And even now, with our calendars and apps and high-definition live streams of eclipses from mountaintop observatories, even now, there remains a hush when the eclipse begins, a pause in conversation, a slowing of thought. People gather still, in fields and backyards and rooftops, and they look up not with fear, perhaps, but with something close to reverence. There is a weight to it, a solemnity. The moon does not change shape. It is not destroyed, but it is hidden, covered by a shadow so complete that it feels symbolic, whether one believes in symbols or not. And when that shadow slips away, when the edge of the moon begins to glow once more like a silver coin rising from ink, the breath returns. Quiet awe, relief, a memory, maybe of a time when this was all we knew of the divine, that it came and went, appeared and vanished, and we could only watch, for the moon in its fullness is a kind of promise, and the eclipse is the breaking of that promise, however brief. It reminds us that nothing is fixed, that even the heavens can falter, that even the most constant of lights can disappear, swallowed by a shadow that comes without sound or warning. And while we know now what that shadow is, how it moves and why, there is still something unsettling the experience of it. Something that bypasses the intellect and speaks directly to the soul. It is not just darkness. It is interruption, a dissonance in the music of the cosmos. And in dreams, too, eclipses have always held power. People who sleep through an eclipse often report dreams of endings and beginnings, of paths closing and doors opening. They speak of being lost in strange places, of seeking light and not finding it, of voices without faces, of transformations they did not choose. And when they wake, the feeling lingers like smoke, a sense that something has passed through them in the night, that something was taken or left behind. So the lunar eclipse, with all its slow grandeur, remains not just an event in the sky, but a turning point in the hidden places of the mind. It calls forth the old stories, the wolves, the demons, the shadows, and rituals, and with them, the old emotions, fear, wonder, helplessness, awe. It reminds us that we are small, that we are temporary, that the moon, for all its beauty, does not belong to us, and yet we wait for it to return. We trust, despite the darkness. We believe, despite the shadow. And when the moon steps back into its light, we breathe again, not because the fear is gone, but because we have passed through it. Together, and overhead, the sky forgets the disruption. But we do not. We remember. We always remember. And though the moon had returned to its place in the sky, shining once more with its quiet certainty after the eclipse had passed, it had left behind a lingering awareness, a memory not of its absence, but of what that absence stirred within. And in that aftermath, people found themselves more attuned to its constant presence once again, not merely as light or omen, but as company, as witness, as the only familiar face in a sky that so often felt vast and silent. For the moon, unlike any other celestial body, offers a strange kind of intimacy, its path regular, its appearance familiar, its face unchanged across the years, even centuries. And yet, in that very familiarity lies the seed of something else, something soft and slow and aching, that makes itself known not in crowds or celebrations, but in solitude, in the hush that comes when all other voices fade, when a house is quiet and the world feels far away, when a person is left alone with their thoughts, and the only thing moving in the night is the moon overhead. There is a loneliness that belongs to the moon and always has. It is not sharp or cruel, but deep and patient, like the stillness at the bottom of a lake or the hush in a room after a long goodbye. For the moon is alone in the sky, not like the stars, which crowd together in constellations and clusters, or the sun, which dominates with warmth and life. The moon is companionless, its orbit empty before its slow dance with Earth, and even that closeness is distant. It does not speak. It does not change its expression. It simply circles, silent and removed, watching. And perhaps that is why it has always been a moon that those in isolation speak of first. Sailors on long voyages across oceans with no land in sight would mark the moon's rising like a friend's arrival, their voices falling quiet as the silver path stretched across black waves, reminding them that though they were far from home, they were still beneath the same sky. Prisoners locked behind stone walls would measure time not by clocks, but by the phases of the moon that slipped into their cells through narrow windows, a reminder that the world outside was still turning even when they stood still. Hermits, monks, and those who chose silence as devotion would speak softly in journals and letters of the comfort they found in the moon's company, how it kept vigil with them through the long nights of thought and prayer, a celestial companion that neither asked nor answered, but simply remained. But not all who were alone sought the moon as comfort. For others, especially those cast into solitude not by choice but by fate or cruelty or collapse, the moon became not a friend, but a haunting, its face too still, its gaze too steady, its light too revealing. In the quiet of isolation, the mind turns inward, searching itself for meaning, for distraction, for escape, and when it finds only silence, it begins to invent. It makes ghosts from shadows. It builds voices out of memory. It listens for footsteps that never come. And outside, the moon watches. In the old asylums where those deemed mad were once kept away from the world, isolation was considered treatment. Solitary cells with barred windows, small courtyards where the moon could be seen but never touched. And it was under this gaze that many unraveled further, their letters and diaries filled with references not to doctors or family, but to the moon itself. They wrote of it moving too quickly, of its eyes blinking, of whispers in the light. They spoke to it, argued with it, wept beneath it, and though their words were dismissed as symptoms, there is something in their pain that echoes even now. A sense that being watched in silence, being seen but never answered, can drive a person slowly, quietly, toward the edge of themselves. Even in literature and art, the connection between the moon and the solitary mind is woven tightly. Poets speak of midnight walks beneath the moon as a kind of confession, a dialogue with something that cannot judge but also cannot soothe. Painters depict lonely figures bathed in moonlight, their backs turned to the viewer, their thoughts unreachable. Composers write nocturnes, songs of night, where the melody meanders like thought, gentle and sad, unresolved. These are not expressions of terror. They are expressions of longing, of the strange comfort found in being alone beneath something constant, even if that constancy brings no warmth. For the moon is not warm. It offers no heat, no shelter, no sound. It illuminates, but it does not comfort. It reveals, but it does not respond. And in that, it becomes a kind of mirror, especially for those in solitude. It reflects back the self, stripped of noise and distraction, and what it shows is not always easy to bear. In the moonlight, there is no hiding. And for those already lost in their own minds, already drifting without anchor or name, that reflection can feel like accusation, like abandonment. There is a quiet madness that grows in isolation, a kind that does not shout or break, but erodes. A soft, slow wearing away of certainty, of rhythm, of self. And the moon, steady and unchanged, becomes both witness and measure, Its phases mark the passage of time in a place where days and hours blur. Its presence marks each night as real, even when all else feels like dream. And so the isolated person, whether in prison or cabin, hospital or tower, often finds themselves tethered to moon without meaning to. It becomes the only face that returns, the only watcher that does not turn away. And yet, there's a strange kind of solace in that constancy, in knowing that no matter how alone one feels, the moon is always there, that even in madness, there's a shared sky, that the same moon shines on others who feel as lost, as quiet, as untethered, that in a world so often fractured and loud, there remains one light that is soft and slow and familiar, and in that there is comfort, not the comfort of warmth or words, but of presence. And so, night after night, the moon rises and the solitary look up, whether from towers or windows, from hospital beds or desert paths, and they see something not of earth, not a man, but still somehow kindred, a reminder that they are not the only ones awake, not the only ones searching. And the moon says nothing. It never has, but it remains. And sometimes, in the deep quiet of a lonely night, that is enough. And while the moon hovered silently in the sky, casting its pale and ancient light across oceans and deserts, through the windows of city apartments and the rafters of sleeping barns, it entered not only the world of waking minds, but slipped, unnoticed and weightless, into the unguarded chambers of sleep, into the shifting terrain of dreams, where reason softens and time bends, and the conscious self, so concerned with structure and control, is gently laid down and replaced by something older, something fluid, something deeply touched by shadow and symbol. For though the sun governs a world of daylight, action, and the visible, it is the moon that has long ruled a world of night, of the unseen, of the inward turning, and in the realm of dreams, that dominion becomes complete. The moon, with its pull on tides and blood, also tugs at the tides of the mind, stirring beneath the surface of thought, shaping images and emotions not with language, but with rhythm, presence, and light. Dreams have always been mysterious, their meanings elusive, their imagery strange and personal, and yet across cultures and centuries, the moon has appeared again and again in the dreamscapes of those who record them. It floats over fields that do not exist, hangs above mountains never climbed, turns red or blue or golden in the minds of sleeping men and women, who wake uncertain whether what they've seen was prophecy or illusion. And more than this, the moon seems to influence not only the content of dreams, but their texture, the way they feel, their weight, their pull. Those who sleep beneath a full moon often speak of vivid dreams, restless ones, filled with symbolism, tension, transformation. Some say they dream of water, of endless reflections. Others describe wandering through strange landscapes, guided by a moon that seems to speak without sound. Still others wake with a sense of having been seen, watched not with menace, but with ancient, knowing eyes. The science of sleep has tried, carefully and cautiously, to measure the moon's influence on dreaming. Sleep labs of machines that hum and graphs that spike have tracked brain waves through the lunar cycle, and while results are not always consistent, there are hints, whispers in the data, that during full moon, deep sleep may be shorter, REM sleep, where dreams are born, may come more quickly, and the dreams themselves may carry a sharper edge, a more vivid color. Researchers have found that melatonin, the hormone that governs our sleep-wake rhythm, can fluctuate with lunar phases, even in people cut off from natural light, as though the body, like the ocean, remembers the moon even when it cannot see it. But beyond these findings, which speak to patterns in chemicals and electrical pulses, there remains the deeper truth, one that data cannot fully touch, that the moon feels different, that it enters the dream not as an object, but as a presence. In ancient times, dreams were not considered random. They were messages, visions, pathways to the divine or the hidden parts of the soul, and the moon, always associated with mystery and change, was seen as both the gatekeeper and the messenger. In Babylon, priests called Baru interpreted lunar dreams as signs from the gods, charting their phases and meanings with meticulous care. In Egypt, the goddess Isis, often depicted crowned by the moon, was said to send dreams of protection and healing. In Greece, the moon was tied to Selene and later to Hecate, goddess of witchcraft and the crossroads, who walked the boundary between sleep and wakefulness, light and shadow, guiding dreamers to the underworld of their own subconscious. And in this underworld, the vast, unlit place where the hidden parts of the psyche dwell, the moon glows like a distant lantern, illuminating not the roads, but the emotions that run alongside them. It does not show the way. It simply shows that there is one. And those who walk through dreamlands often find that when the moon appears, it is a symbol of revelation or change. A shift is coming. A truth is near. The moon in a dream may signal the unveiling of something long buried, or the surfacing of a memory wrapped in fog. Sometimes, it marks the presence of the other self, the one we do not show the world, but carry always within. Artists, poets, and mystics have long written of dreams that arrive with the full moon, dreams of flying, of drowning, of standing beneath a moon that grows until it fills the sky, pressing down like fate or lifting up like release. These dreams are not always peaceful. Some are filled with longing so deep it aches upon waking, others with terror, so quiet it takes a full day to name. But all share a certain clarity, not of meaning, but of emotion. They feel real. They linger. They move like tides that do not recede. And so the moon becomes, in the dream world, both guide and mirror. It does not dictate the story. It reflects it. It makes visible what is already there, beneath the surface. Like a candle held near a map drawn in invisible ink, the moon brings the unconscious into partial view, not with sharp lines, but with suggestions, impressions, the way light touches water. And in that partial view, there is room for exploration, for healing, for understanding not in words, but in images that feel true even if they cannot be explained. Some say that the moon influences not just the content of dreams, but the dreamer's openness to them, that during the full moon, people are more likely to remember their dreams, to wake with sense that something important has been felt, if not understood. And in a time when dreams are often dismissed as noise, fragments of memory, meaningless firings of the brain, this renewed attention is a kind of quiet rebellion, a return to something older, a belief, perhaps, that there is still mystery in the self, still messages worth listening to. The moon then becomes the bridge, not just between night and day, but between waking and dreaming, between the conscious and the unconscious, between the seen and the deeply hidden. It does not carry answers, but it opens a door to questions we do not know how to ask. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the dream has ended and the moon begins to set, there is a stillness that lingers in the room, a hush that holds the edges of sleep like hands gently cupping water. The dream fades, but its feeling remains, and the moon, as always, slips away without a word, leaving behind only a soft glow in the sense that something has been touched, if only for a moment. And though we may not remember the details, what was said, what was seen, we carry it with us, like a tide beneath the surface, gentle but insistent. And the moon, rising again that night, will begin the process anew, ever watching, ever waiting, ever wandering through the hidden corridors of the mind, quiet and eternal. And still, no matter how many tales are told beneath its glow, no matter how many fears or fascinations rise and fall, with each passing generation, the moon returns, quiet, constant, untouched by the centuries of wonder and worry cast upon it. It circles above us, patient and unchanged, a soft companion to our restless nights. It does not need to speak. Its silence is enough. And in that silence we find something ancient, a comfort that does not promise answers but presence, a rhythm that matches our own, sometimes full, sometimes hidden, sometimes between, but always returning, always beginning again. Because what the moon offers us more than myth or mystery is this quiet reminder that we are part of something larger, something slower, something that moves even when we feel still. It reflects not just our fear of change, but our longing for it. It mirrors not only the chaos within, but the quiet strength we carry through it. And though it may stir the tides of our thoughts, may cast shadows on the walls of our dreams, it also brings a soft and steady light, just enough to find our way. And so, as the night deepens and the moon rises once more above sleeping fields and silent cities, let us not resist its gaze, but welcome it, as countless others are before us. Let its pale glow wash over all the noise and worry. Let it ease the breath, soften the thoughts, and remind us that we are not alone, that we are watched gently, that we are part of a story far older than ourselves, written in quiet turns across the sky. And now, as your eyes grow heavier and the world grows still, know that the moon will remain high and calm above it all, watching, waiting, lighting the way into sleep. Good night.